Sorcery of the Stony Heart, written by Kevan, narrated by Rafe Beckley. Chapter 1. The Man with the Crooked Leg. Autumn, 1735. Evening stole across London by degree, leaving first the river, then the bridges, streets and alleys, and eventually the chimneys, steeples and towers in dusky shadow. Such fading of the light crept earlier each day as winter neared, as if the chill wind fingering collars and prying at pane and jamb weren't proof enough. As the gloaming deepened, no one gave much thought, at first, to the man with the crooked leg. No gentleman was he, the tattered coat and stained breeches made plain. Normally, the destitute, if noticed as anything more than obstacles to achieve hurried distance from, faded from memory faster than daylight left the late autumn sky. Yet the man with the crooked leg, eyed, avoided, averted, remained rather stubbornly in the back of the mind, even as his slouching gait receded into the darkness and bustle. A glimpse of his face, slack, pale, and scarred, engendered little in the way of pity, and if any of the men and women who passed him by held even the smallest flame of curiosity as to his condition, a luckless soldier, labourer bereft by gruesome accident, malformed by the Lord at birth, such questions drifted from their minds, along with the breath that drifted from their mouths. A shape, a curl, then nothing as night consumed it. And yet... The lawyer from Holborn Hill, who'd grunted his way past the man with the crooked leg, unhappy to find himself slowed for even a minute, spent the hours leading up to midnight, holding the small bottle of poison he'd stolen, his mind settled after so many months. As he imagined the face of his employer, one Jedediah Croft, Esquire, growing mottled red and then purple before collapsing onto his writing desk, the lawyer recalled the milky eye of the man with the crooked leg, an empty window into a plague house. The young mother who'd recoiled at the unwashed stench of the man with the crooked leg, putting the collar of her cloak to her nose and mouth as she passed behind him at the corner of Chancery Lane and Carey Street, later wondered how far he'd ended up shuffling as she stared at little Geoffrey's crib. She also caught herself thinking, again, how much more peaceful her life might be were her sister's 3 squalling children smothered and in their graves. 2 sailors from Philadelphia, primed with ale and rum from the Duck and Drake, ready to explore the alehouses and taverns of the Strand until their ship, the Pearl, slipped its lines and set out into the restless gales of the grey Atlantic come dawn, would both quietly believe they saw his sallow face peering at them through the smoky public rooms again that evening, shortly before their argument escalated into a broken bottle, a severed artery, and iron manacles. The Pearl sailed without them. So it went. Chance encounters. Dark keys, perhaps already well burnished, perhaps newly discovered, examined and considered. Some slid into a shadowy lock and turned. Click. Others slipped away out of guilt or shame or fear of damnation, but none tossed aside, only secreted away for the time being. For the man with the crooked leg was more generous than anyone might have guessed. A locksmith was he, ready to unbolt the darkest urges of the heart, sharing his craft with all who crossed his path, a key here, a key there, one for you, and here's one for you, of course, please, take. He fancied his name might have been Charity. Still, he had a promise to keep, and a special key to deliver. As the fog rolled in off the Thames, the man with the crooked leg limped from lane to street to alleyway, quite content as the lanterns strained against the thickening night, always with a dark gift for those he passed along the way. Chapter 2. Confiscation of Tomes. The dust puffed in a rolling cloud. A fine skein of it landed on the glass of the lantern, another on the front of August Swaine's waistcoat and jacket, and still more in his hair. He blinked. "Oh dear, I didn't think about that," Phineas Hozier sputtered for a moment, his mouth searching for the always elusive letter P. Pardon me, Mr. Swaine, sir." He lowered the book and set to brushing Swaine's jacket with his fingers, wrinkling his nose at the residual dust still hanging in the air. Swaine raised his hand. "That's quite all right, don't trouble yourself." "Just take a moment, sir." "I'll survive, thank you, please. Yes, that's fine. Let's get on with it, shall we?" It required a pair of steps back before Hozier relented, evidently unhappy about leaving the job half-finished. "That is the Hill volume." Hozier looked down at the book in his hand, the noteworthy span of his nose veering like the prow of a ship tacking into the wind. His uneven eyes widened as though the sight of the book struck him with the thrill of discovery all over again. "Ah, yes, Derrick Hill, as I said, sir." He lifted the weighty book and caught himself just prior to blowing the dust from the cover and spine a second time, settling for wiping the leather with his palm in a series of fussy circles. Behind him, a wall-length trio of bookshelves rose to the ceiling of the narrow alcove. Each shelf, dusty as the Hill volume, bore a most arresting assemblage of books on magic. Under the confiscation of tomes on conjury and magic acts, possession of such volumes by a subject of the Crown was made criminal in 1649, punished by fines and imprisonment upon discovery. While the University of Cambridge was, in secret, granted sole permission to maintain the collection of books confiscated by the Acts, a brisk and illicit market for such works had continued in the intervening decades, necessitating the onerous precautions and security surrounding the university's collection. The visit hadn't come easily, nor cheaply. That Swaine found the shelves sagging underneath 4 fraudulent tomes for every one genuine article didn't surprise him. Oh, there were the obvious real volumes one would expect to find in such a collection. Works by Gustave Koffler, Alfred Summerfield, Thomas Wexler, Jérôme Barnave, Ephraim Rush, and others. Fine, as far as they went. Swaine had read most of them when he'd still been a lad in Lincoln, and had long since moved on to more obscure works. None of those presented themselves among the dozens upon dozens of counterfeit tomes with such ridiculous titles as Sorceries and Hexes for the Versant Conjurer, The Laws of Inerrant Devilry, and Vile Keys to Witchcraft, books whose purview and pedigree hardly merited any place on any bookshelf, let alone being held under lock and key within the Acts collection. Whatever purpose they'd been written for, bilking the foolish out of money, frightening the lustful out of, or perhaps into, someone else's undergarments, goosing the attendants in nave and chapel by those underwhelmed by pastors' more mundane admonitions on the fragility of the soul, had nothing to do with actual magic or, heaven forfend, sorcery. Still, even a handful of worthless stones might contain a gem, should one know where to look. Swaine took the book from Hozier. The words "spells of elemental transference" were embossed into the faded leather of the cover. Hill's work was nearly impossible to come by, but one run of his lone volume had been printed, totaling 90 copies. In the intervening half-century, beyond the more prosaic fates of Silverfish, Flood, and Confiscation, there had been the dreadful problem of the magic within the book itself overspilling its bindings, as it were. The precise defect appeared to involve a transcription of a spell mellifluously named Hallowed Shallows of Shadowed Halos. It was a clever, perhaps too clever, interpretation of a classic tracking spell which leveraged the principles of transferent adaptation to divine the comings and goings of a targeted victim. Said victim would, ideally, be unaware of the curious patch of shadow that trailed several feet behind their head. Due to a flaw in the printing, or so Hill had claimed for the remainder of his short life, it wasn't uncommon for the book to seep shadows, often to the point where it became impossible to find. More alarming, a similar untamed expression of magic was tied to another spell within the volume, the unquenchable raven of fire. Swaine opened the book with care. It appeared to be genuine and intact. The print still read well, the paper, while crisp, wasn't damaged, and the bindings hadn't loosened. "Well done, Mr. Hozier," he said. "I knew the name sounded familiar, sir." Swaine scanned several pages. Yes, this was what he'd been looking for. Hill's reputation had been damaged by being the author of a frequently disappearing and occasionally self-immolating book, a book that any experienced practitioner of the unseen arts would think twice before introducing to their own collection, let alone their dwelling. Nevertheless, his research into the realm of alchemical influences on the principle of transferent adaptation had proven to be well ahead of his contemporaries. Swaine had sought a copy of the book for well over a decade. "It's kept in a—" Hozier began. Swaine flipped a few more pages while the man tamed his stammer and continued. "Box, lead-lined iron." "Yes, prudent." Swaine closed the volume and tucked it under his arm. "Wouldn't want to burn down the university's library, now would we?" "So it's true, sir. Amazing. Truly amazing, all of it." Hozier crossed his arms and shook his head, putting in mind a sparrow in a bird bath, shaking off drops of water. Prize tucked under his arm, Swaine paced the shelves, scanning the titles, not expecting to be excited about any of the book's brethren. Still, he always looked. "And they're all accounted for?" "Everyone's, sir. Every 3 months I make the accounting, though I've only done it the once. So far, they're all there." "Never an unexpected guest?" "By guest, I take it you mean book, sir?" "Indeed I do." Hozier shook his head. They only come in by decree, sir, authorised by His Majesty's man." "The Earl of Middlesex, yes, I understand." "A whole procedure is required, and there hasn't been one in a decade, I understand." "So if one appeared, you or your predecessor would know it within months?" "As I said, sir, they don't just appear." Swaine arched an eyebrow, wondering. "Of course you're right." Satisfied that the contents of the collection matched the secretive list that Hozier had provided him the week before, he spun on his heel and slid the hill inside his frock-coat. "My gratitude knows no bounds, Mr. Hozier." "And you'll have it back within the week, sir?" "To the hour." "My employment will depend upon it, sir." "You have no reason to worry, my good man. A book in my hands is safer than a sleeping babe in the arms of her nursemaid." Hozier lowered his voice to a near whisper. "And, well, the other detail in our bargain, sir, the compensation? Why, of course." Swaine pulled out a small leather sack containing 20 guineas. The weight of it reminded him it was nearly the last of his money, most of it having gone to books, and little more on the horizon. The Countess who'd kept him funded for the prior 2 years had finally tired of his unwillingness to submit to her romantic overtures. Making matters worse, an intemperate use of magic on his part had drawn the scrutiny of the authorities, thereby cutting off other avenues of making more money through his practice of the unseen arts. Thus his vow to get by on 1 meal each day, to steep his tea 6 times to stretch it out, to bear the chill left by a barren coal scuttle, to patch his clothing as best he might. A fragile plan. But as far as he saw it, he had little choice. Books were his food, work his sustenance. The rest would have to sort itself out. Still, as the money left his hand, a flutter of anxiety, apparently deaf to his dedication and ideals, twisted his stomach. Hozier nodded thanks and half bowed, sliding the sack into his pocket with spidery fingers. "Have to check it's there later, won't I?" he said with a nervous laugh. "Dealing with a magician, as it were. Could appear back where it came from. Spells." Swaine straightened his spine. "In the first place, Mr. Hozier, I am a practitioner of the unseen arts, not a magician. And in the second, my word is without reproach, as you shall see." Hozier waved his fingers as though unconsciously mimicking his notion of spell-casting. "I beg your pardon, sir, merely a jest. There was, however, the other aspect of our deal, sir. Not to imply you've forgotten, of course." Swaine struggled to not roll his eyes. "Yes, of course, I hadn't forgotten, Mr. Hozier. Arrive at my rooms at 2:30 tomorrow afternoon." Hozier's eyes blinked as though struggling to contain the unadulterated excitement that appeared in them. Swaine didn't want to know what went through the poor fellow's mind.
"Should I dress in any particular fashion, sir?"
Hozier whispered. "How you dress is immaterial."
"I don't have finery, sir."
"As I said." While Hozier's tongue seemed to have gotten away from him, perhaps his stammer grew more combative as his cheeks flushed, Swaine nodded his thanks and good night. He let himself out of the Acts collection and made his way through the darkened stacks of the empty library, deathly quiet at midnight, his mind already preparing to tussle with the infamous spells of elemental transference. Chapter 3. Derimeresque. The mind is a forge. Kept properly stoked, it is capable of releasing base ideas from their rigid state, ready to be hammered into new shapes, new tools, new instruments. Left to cool, such transformation is hopeless, and one has little choice but to accept the world as presented. August Swaine kept his mind white-hot, as evidenced by the quarters he inhabited above Billiter Square, in sight of the tower. Books laid claim to every free vertical surface, an occupying army bivouacked across 3 dim rooms. Mantel, writing desk, table, cupboard, sill, and even stretches of the time-worn flooring vanished beneath the stacks. Particular passages marked with scraps of paper, old quills, ribbons, stray threads, thin nails, and, in one case, a fishbone, kindling for his mind. And, like a proper smith, additional tools of various utility sat within reach. Bouquets of quills, inkpots, sheaves of paper in quality ranging from correspondence-worthy to alleyway toss-off, magnifying glass, tinderbox, lantern, candle, rows of bottles, vials, and snuff-boxes, carefully labelled, containing powder, tincture, or flecks in a painter's palette of hues. Book-sized slabs of marble bore the scars and scorches of scores of experiments. Yet one might think that to watch Swaine at work would have none of the drama of the blacksmith, the clang, the heat, the sparks, the subtle shadings of heated metal lighting the scene, the display of exertion and strength, man subjecting normally unyielding material to his will. A veritable glimpse of the engine of civilization itself, iconic and singular. Yet Swaine, to outward appearances a slender gentleman of measured bearing with a glint of unwavering intelligence in his gaze, had but 2 soft hands, unscarred by physical labour. Still, he put every blacksmith in London to shame. Observing the man at work might reveal flames untethered to wick or lamp, sprung from neither spark nor candle, and in colours ranging from snow-shadow blue to glinting emerald to the white of stars. Glyphs scribed in magic ink might smoulder and shimmer. Lines of metal filings, some common, some precious, might rearrange themselves as though pushed by invisible fingers. A book, a quill, a bell might float through the room, untouched by human hand. Thin metal chains describing unusual shapes could rise into the air on their own. Derimeresque glimpses of worlds quite beyond Fenchurch Street might appear within glamours arranged on the floor. Not that anyone might see such treasures by peering through keyhole or window. No, each entrance and egress to Swaine's rooms hummed with spells to denude the scene of any hint of magic. Under suspicion by various agents of His Majesty who'd be more than happy to jail him for the commission of magic, or at the very least hound him from London by assailing his reputation, turning even his acquaintance into a social liability, his work remained as secret as he could manage. Yet from the street below could occasionally be heard the bay of a hound. Curious whispers, a strange tolling bell, sighing winds, faint music of unknown origin. These were but some of the sounds that troubled the haberdasher whose shop stood beneath Swaine's room. The man strove to never work past sunset. Were such artifacts of concentrated effort not beyond the artistry of the most accomplished smith? Was there a craftsman, painter, or watchmaker in all of London whose industry rivaled the pure spectacle of Swaine's research? And yet, for all that, his greatest strides, His most unimagined leaps in intuition often came when Swaine paused, staring into the fire in the grate, hand resting on the page he'd taken to task. Gears and springs of implication, connection, and insight exploded and reassembled. Those moments, silent but for the snap and huff of a common fire, the ticking of Swaine's pocket watch. It was in just such a moment Hill's spells of elemental transference cracked open on the desk before him when a tenuous knock on the door dislodged Swaine's concentration. As the knock repeated, he felt the fragile edifice of a looming breakthrough collapse back into a heap of guesswork. He frowned and flipped open the lid of his watch. 2:30 on the mark. Another knock. "Yes, yes," Swaine called out. "No need to audition for the role of drummer boy, that's quite enough." He strode through to the front room, his thoughts about Hill trailing behind him, cobwebs refusing to release their grip on his attention. With a muttered incantation, he passed his hand over the glyph he'd embedded into the inside panel of the door. After a moment, a faint outline of shifting blue light appeared 2 inches away from the door, corporal, man-sized, and with enough angles and twitches to assure him that Phineas Hozier stood alone on the other side of the door. Swaine spoke the word of cessation, and the strange outline dissipated like glowing embers that floated to the floor and winked out. He flung open the door. "Mr. Hozier, how punctual!" Had he emphasized the P in punctual with a hint of aggression? Perhaps he had. Forcing his frown from his face, he waved Hozier inside. Equanimity was a challenge at all times, more so when his thoughts were interrupted, yet he reminded himself that he had agreed to the terms, and the manner in which Hill had already stirred his thoughts was more than worth whatever nonsense Hozier had in mind. The man's eyes flitted from bookstack to bookstack.
"If I didn't know better, I'd worry that your magic has summoned my work to haunt my steps. Everywhere I seem to be, piles of books."
"A curious use of magic that would be," Swaine said. Still, his thoughts ran down a combination of spells that might effect that very result. The possibility certainly existed, even as the rationale for doing so was suspect. Had he not loved the unseen arts with such ferocity, a mind so inclined might otherwise be a bane. As Hozier appeared content to continue staring around the front room while shaking off rain from his jacket, Swaine cleared his throat. Hozier snapped his head around.
"Yes, a curious use. I was jesting, of course."
"I see.
"And I suppose we must prepare me for my rendezvous with destiny."
Swaine sniffed back a snide comment. He crossed into the next room, motioning for Hozier to remain standing, and retrieved 6 ingredients from the workbench he'd fashioned out of an old chest and a vertical door taken from its hinges. "Destiny is a weighty word, Mr. Hozier," he called back into the other room as he selected the proper bottles.
"Love is a weighty matter,"
Hozier called back. "One upon which you're prepared to add a thumb to the scales, you're quite sure?"
"Couldn't be more sure, sir. I knew it from the moment I set eyes on her."
Swaine wondered about the young woman's eyes settling on Hozier, and if that moment had lingered in her mind for more than the time it took to look away. Still, the conjuration he had in mind was mild and relegated solely to affecting Hozier. Swaine found such tawdry uses of magic in the general category of heart-binding, implacable infatuation, or beholden lust, spells designed to beguile the senses of the object d'amour, to be offensive. If one has no morals or qualms, why not save time and trouble and simply knock the person over the head and kidnap them, an equally abhorrent solution to unrequited love? On the other hand, if Hozier himself was afflicted with an unasked-for and undeserved set of challenges that might make him a less than desirable suitor, well, who was to say that behind his stammer, not to mention beneath his obvious social deficits, there didn't lie a faithful and true heart? As for Swaine, his best advice, to shun such nonsense altogether, was always received with a look suggesting that he'd failed to grasp the simplest rules of life itself. He hardly bothered any longer. "Here we are, Mr. Hozier." He cleared a space on the table and put down the ingredients. All we need to render you as confident and charming as possible." Hozier's fingers danced against the leg of his breeches.
"Will I feel the effects?"
"Of course you will. Not to worry, however. A slight tingling is the most often noted phenomenon, usually the face and neck." Working quickly, Swaine mixed the sawdust from the heartwood of black poplar tree with ground rose quartz in a brass flask. After a minute of stirring, he whispered a phrase over it in the traditional Old English. The mixture crackled, sparks dancing across the surface. Hozier's eyes widened.
"Does this have a name, Mr. Swaine?"
The actual name of the potion was Malskrung Thesberg, or Charm the Pig. Swaine raised an eyebrow. The traditional name roughly translates to Lantern of the Heart, designed as it is to allow the true strength and charm, I suppose, of the heart to shine forth unimpeded by the reticence of, shall we say, shyness of the wearer, an accelerant to your natural charisma.
I see, Hozier said. "Like rum, only I won't vomit."
"Yes, well, let's hope not." Swaine measured out a dozen seeds of dried tansy from a stained bottle, the earthy scent filling his nose. Once stirred into the mixture, he retrieved a dried lark's feather from a fourth bottle and used the quill end to etch the alchemical symbol for the heart into the clay-like surface of the potion while repeating the incantation. "Wonderful. Step closer, if you would." Hozier glanced at him, his lips thin, then nodded and stood next to him. Swaine slid a fine pair of tweezers from his waistcoat pocket. "Lean down." Hozier did. Swaine plucked a hair from the man's head. "There we are." Running a hand over the spot where the hair had come from, Hozier grimaced and straightened.
"Good thing it didn't call for a tooth, or a finger."
"Fingers can be potent ingredients, to be sure, Mr. Hozier. Be thankful you're not in need of such magic, and not just for the sacrifice of a digit, believe me." Swaine worked the hair into the paste and held the brass flask over the nearest candle flame with a pair of iron tongs. He watched as the mixture bubbled and further liquefied. As it did, tiny licks of the flame sputtered upward. "Now," he said, "once this has cooled, it merely awaits activation."
"And that entails what?"
"Quite simple. Using the opposite side of the lark's feather, face north, and in a clockwise order dab a touch of the mixture, enough to leave a clear mark, not enough to clump, on the following spots: the inside of each elbow, the underside of each wrist, between your big and adjacent toes, a handspan below your navel, the most prominent bone in your neck, the crown of your head, your sacrum, and ending just above your heart, to the left of your sternum, your left." Swaine waved the tongs to cool the mixture, and then readied a small bottle. "The magic will last for somewhat less than 4 hours. There's enough for possibly 3 applications. Bear in mind that each subsequent instance will be correspondingly less powerful due to the principle of causative retrenchment of Burnsian energies, by a factor of 3 to be specific. Also, best to apply it within the hour before you expect to need it, to maximize potency."
"Causative—"
Hozier's brow furrowed.
"Surely you'll be joining me, Mr. Swaine. I'll never remember all of that."
"You remember the location of hundreds of books in the library, do you not?"
"There's a system."
"I can write it down for you if you wish. A system."
"But I would feel much safer with you initiating the magic, sir."
"I've already initiated it."
"What if I make a mistake?"
"You won't. It's trivial."
"I'd really feel much more confident if you could at least be there while I did it."
Swaine wondered how Hozier ever accomplished anything in life with such a paltry supply of confidence to draw from. 1 cardinal direction to locate and face, 11 spots to mark. What could be more simple? Then again, the man was an assistant to an assistant librarian, had worn the same pair of breeches and shirt each time Swaine had spoken with him, and apparently lived under the stairs in the house of his cousin, a baker with 6 children, on Fan's Alley. Perhaps he'd never actually accomplished anything, and there he was, dreaming that a woman might be drawn to such a man. For most people, Swaine supposed, dreams were no more than ghosts from a future that would, in all likelihood, never come to pass, immaterial, yet haunting just the same. "Fine," Swaine said. "When do you need it?"
"Why, today, sir," Hozier nodded, "and I thought you might accompany me to the theatre. Catherine is an actress, playing Cordelia in King Lear at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. Wonderful, sir. I've seen it 7 times this month. Nearly ran out of money."
An actress? Swaine wondered if he'd picked a strong enough magic. "Tell me you've spoken with this Catherine, Hozier." The fellow nodded so vigorously that Swaine thought for a moment he was having a fit of some kind.
"Marvellous, marvellous woman. Eyes like windows into a world I'd give anything to see. I thought them sad at first, but they miss nothing. The eyes of an artist. A smile like spring after winter. Hair that tumbles across her shoulders like a precious mane."
"Yes, I can see you've had your fill of Shakespeare," Swaine said. "And you've spoken with her?"
"I have, sir. The finest minutes of my life. I praised her performance. Gracious she was, and kind. Asked me my name, my profession. Amazing, sir. She laughed at a jest I made."
Anything was possible, Swaine conceded. Fine, he would accompany Hozier to the theatre. In fact, it might well be productive, inasmuch that the impasse he'd reached with Hill cried out for mental redirection. And like any good blacksmith, Swaine knew when to strike the steel and when to let it cool when the fires have grown too dull or too hot. Chapter 4. Art Demands. Swaine knew artistry when he saw it, for art demands. He knew that as well as anyone. Nothing could be simpler than doing nothing more than what is expected. Most of the world did so, and rarely went more than a day without a meal or a night's rest, proving again and again that the mind needn't be anything other than soft and flabby. Nurturing a trade or a craft to a basic level of proficiency required more effort, though in truth not much more than a degree of attention encased in years of repetition. Mastering such a calling was another feat altogether, for it took elevation beyond the mere facts, a unification of purpose and effort, an awareness of the subtle interplay between the laws of the materials and the nature of the human mind, and a willingness to endure the sacrifice required to develop such instincts. But true artistry was of a different order. Perhaps it required a seed of genius, though where unwavering will ended and genius began was often a mystery, to subsume all else in the service of reaching a summit untrodden by others, to gather in the unseen essence of humanity and meld it with an object, an effort, an insight, to lift up civilization, all of it thereafter, even a single inch. Well, the membership fee to that society was steep, and when one was familiar with the demands extracted to create art at that level, one recognized and appreciated it fully when encountered elsewhere. Whenever such flames reached upward to the heavens, the sure sign of a mind, a soul, blazing in the pursuit of a calling, Swaine recognized a kindred spirit, a burning, radiant soul. In such instances, some essential nutrient was replenished, fortifying him to face the demands of his own art. So it was that as he sat on the green cloth-covered bench in the pit before the stage, next to the ceaseless ticks and twitches of Phineas Hozier, Swaine found himself captivated by the whirlwind of Lear, not merely the raging howls cried out into the storm that is mortality, but also by the kinship he felt with the playwright himself. For surely Shakespeare knew the price to be paid to scale such peaks of achievement. The thousands of hours spent so focused that hunger, thirst, sleep all passed by unnoticed, the arrival of dawn unexpected, the tedium of all but the work itself.
"Should my mouth be this dry?"
Hozier whispered to him. They'd applied the magicked balm to him just before the short walk to Drury Lane, and a ridiculous affair that had been, Hozier pleading to go, to stop, to wait, all the while apologising for being mortally ticklish. "Did you drink enough water?" Swaine said. From the spell, I mean.
Nothing to do with it.
The cold spots?
Ignore them.
As the enactor of the magic, Swaine was himself immune to the effects. To his fellow theatre-goers, however, Hozier wouldn't appear either bland or afflicted. Instead, a subtle richness to the way the light draped him drew the eye. His features, ordinarily somewhat off-putting, as though the Lord had combined a collection of left-over components, the chin from a babe, the nose from a 7-foot grandfather from Arabia, the brows of a Spaniard, the lips of a humourless headmistress, the eyeballs of a herd animal, would strike the eye as harmonious and lively. His movements would track as graceful, his bearing of leonine confidence. Even his voice, which normally had the grainy texture of an infant who'd squalled for too long, acquired a sonorous intimacy, as though he were relaying a private secret for the listener alone. Sadly, it remained unchanged for Swaine, as Hozier muttered and questioned whether imaginary side effects of the potion weren't spiralling out of control from one minute to the next. As the play reached its denouement, Swaine had to admit that Hozier had been right about two things. The actress Catherine had a talent that outstripped the rest of the company, and only a potent helping of the unseen arts offered the slightest chance that she would manifest the smallest spark of affection for him, and even that might be too much to ask of the art. Still, Swaine had done what he could, and as he stood and raised his hands in applause as the company took to the boards and bowed at the foot of the stage, Hozier flapping his arms beside Swaine, hitting him accidentally with his elbow, he felt a renewed desire to return to his work, inspired by the high art he'd witnessed. Hozier grabbed his arm above the elbow.
You're sure this is working?
Of course I am. Swaine relieved his arm of Hozier's fingers. You haven't noticed the glances you've received?
Glances?
Women and gentlemen alike, all trying to work out who you are, convinced that you're someone important they should know. Perhaps if you'd been less talkative. The crowd flowed into the aisles. Hozier looked around and saw that Swaine wasn't lying.
I usually ignore the stares.
I told you.
And Catherine will see me this way.
As I explained. Now, if you'll excuse me, Mr. Hozier, thank you for bringing me along.
But you must meet Catherine.
I shall leave her in your temporarily capable hands, sir. And remember, you have approximately 70 minutes remaining before the effect wears off. Use them thoughtfully. Swaine turned to go and found himself facing Cordelia, returned to life. The actress was shorter than she seemed on stage, but no less striking for that. A lock of fair hair crossed above eyes the colour of honey, while the stage makeup enhanced the lines of her cheekbones and full lips. She glanced into Swaine's eyes for but a moment, long enough for him to appreciate how poor Hozier might give up all pretence at dignity for the chance to stare into those eyes for longer stretches, then looked past him, raising a delicate hand. "Phineas," she said, "I thought that was you." Hozier smiled and said nothing. While the magic may have made it appear that he was full of self-possession, Swaine realized that the man's mind had frozen up, whatever words he'd readied now locked behind his lips. Could it have been that no woman had ever addressed him with such a tone of joy in her voice? Was he then stunned, a prisoner handed the key to the cell for the first time, a castaway glimpsing sails, finally heading to shore? "Our good Mr. Hozier insisted I witness your performance, Madam Nun," Swaine said. "For all the praise he bestowed on you, I see now that he was understating your gifts." She smiled, not taking her gaze from Hozier. "You're much too kind, Phineas."
"Another wonderful performance, Catherine," Hozier said.
No hint of the trembling of his voice reached her ears, judging by the way her bosom swelled at his words. Seeing that Hozier, or rather the magic that made Hozier as un-Hozier-like as feasible, fully possessed the actress's attention, Swaine slipped off through the crowd, silently wishing the old boy luck. As he paused while the theatre-goers filed through one of the side doors, a hand landed on his back. "August!" Swaine turned. Devon Woods, clerk of the Pells at the Exchequer, clapped him again on the back. A thick-necked man in finery and a full head shorter than Swaine, his round face was largely hidden behind a beard that reached past the cravat around his neck, while a silken tricorn covered his red hair.
"I never took you for a theatre man,"
Woods said. The two had shared rooms in the same building 12 years earlier, when Swaine had first moved to London. Though Woods had left after only 2 years, they'd run into each other from time to time since. "Broadening my horizons, Devon," Swaine said.
"So I've heard, from all sorts of gentlemen."
"Ah, the chair," Swaine cringed. Woods's wide shoulders shook with mirth as they passed through into the 10-foot-wide passageway that led out onto Bridges Street.
"You say that as though it were an accident," Woods said. "You don't commit accidents, August."
I slid the man and his chair all of 6 inches. Around them, Covent Garden bustled as the afternoon light faded. Swaine wished to be back in his rooms. The incident with the chair had gotten around, as he'd feared. Well, he'd only himself to blame.
"The man is Conyers Hargrove, who, as you know as well as I, loves nothing more than argument and controversy."
Since Harwood was the former principal librarian at Cambridge and the current professor of fossils in the university's Department of Earth Sciences, Swaine had thought Harwood might be sympathetic to his bid for access to the Acts collection. The man had so studiously rejected Swaine's assertions that Swaine had retorted with a crass display of magic. "Well, he didn't have much of an argument left," Swaine said.
"And you think that will stop him? No, you've poked the bear, August. He's evidently told everyone who crosses his threshold about your delirium. Even I've heard it."
"Delirium? What nonsense is this?"
"He claims you suffer from visions, hallucinations, a wee touch of madness."
Woods shook his head.
"That you've delved too far into your studies of the literature of magic and finally bitten the forbidden fruit."
"My approach to my studies involves considerably more rigour than anything Harwood has done in decades, and he bloody well knows it." Swaine's shortest fuse lit anew. The disdain with which the allegedly honed minds of the scientific community viewed the unseen arts never failed to rile him. "I ought to have hurled him and the chair he sat his cushioned arse on straight out of the window."
"Be thankful he didn't seek charges. His wife's niece is married to Lionel Sackville. Now there's a man who'd like to see you jailed. They don't care for each other, luckily for you."
Swaine bristled at the mention of Sackville, a man of considerable influence at court, who went to sleep and woke up with thoughts of how he might further the Lord's war against Satan by branding nearly every advance of any note as tainted with the sulphurous stench of hell's machinations. The Acts forbidding magic in England stood on par with the Gospels themselves in Sackville's accounting of the world. Yes, and they're both wrong, fools. Woods watched him closely.
"So you really did it?"
"The commission of magic is a crime, forbidden by law," Swaine smiled. "Of course I did."
"I have to hand it to you, August. You've stuck by your guns. I used to think it no more than a colourful story to pass on if the topic ever came up. The most brilliant man I'd ever met, convinced there was something to all those old books, never wavered."
"No, I never did."
"And is there more?"
Swaine crossed his arms, frowning, thinking about the damage to his name caused by the insufferable Conyers Harwood. "More what?"
"More of what you can do."
"Well, I haven't spent the past decade studying how to rearrange the furniture, if that's what you mean." Woods hooked a thumb in his jacket pocket.
"Have you ever met Thomas Summerfield, recently of Bath, now here in London?"
"Thomas Summerfield? Who is he?"
"Well, number 1, he's exceedingly wealthy. Number 2, he comes, or claims to come, from a line of magicians from before the Acts. Grandfather was someone of note, apparently."
That caught Swaine's full attention. "You don't mean Alfred Summerfield?" Woods nodded, pointing.
"That's the one."
"The man was a giant," Swaine said, "changed the course of English magic." He'd read and reread all of Summerfield's books over the last decade, convinced that his work in the field of harmonic shadow theory put him in the rarefied company of Newton or Bacon. Had the cowards on the throne, and the many ministers slavering for any advantage, and the fops in dark robes throughout the Church of England and the Vatican not been blinded still by the superstitions of illiterate Iron Age peasants, England might have already shrugged off the chains of gruelling labour, fatal infirmity, and debilitating ignorance.
So claims Thomas, and I believe that he's more eager to put his wealth behind any efforts to bring such work back to respectability, Woods said.
He'd best not let Sackville get wind of his delirium.
I'll advise him to leave all nearby furniture in place, save by human hand.
Woods took Swaine's arm and moved him out of the way of a carriage lumbering down the street.
Honestly, I can't imagine why I didn't think of you sooner. He believes what you are expert in and has the means to do something about it. And unless you've conjured up a fortune for yourself with your chair relocation endeavour, a friend like that could be awfully useful in countering the arguments of Harwood and the like. I can arrange for a meeting. What do you say?
Swaine straightened, buttoning his jacket against the wind. Delirium. Such nonsense, especially from one sitting so comfortably within an establishment built on the reputation of a handful of true visionaries but populated by the mediocre, who excelled at nothing as much as they did at playing politics, curating influence, and inflating their own import. Shameless ingratiation had never been for Swaine, and he had the frayed clothing and skimpy coal scuttle to prove it. If that's what it took, well, art demands. A fine idea, Devon. A fine idea, he said. Chapter 5. As London Slept. All it took was a scent, the lightest impression left in the air, the lingering hint of the hidden presence. The man with the crooked leg stood before the darkened theatre, sniffing. Yes, there it was, so difficult to find, yet even as he'd crossed miles of empty countryside, forest and fen, the lonesome roads, mountain passes, rivers and channels, sparse towns, and finally the teeming city, he hadn't forgotten it. The faintest wisp led him ever nearer. Still, the sorcerer hid himself well. For days now the man with the crooked leg criss-crossed London, drawn one way, then another, vexed. And in his wake, he knew, nightmares spread, a plague of dark urges infecting the thoughts of those who noticed him. He was more than happy to help. He had more than enough dark keys, one for every soul in London. Perhaps once he'd delivered the gift he bore, he'd remain, weaving his dark strands here and there, poorest and richest, youngest and oldest, kind soul and murderer alike. The smile that crawled across his face would have wilted the hope carried in the heart of anyone who saw it. But the street was empty, a hard rain lashing the cobblestones and brick, gusting up against shutter and window. The man with the crooked leg turned slowly, searching. Without warning, he cocked his head toward the doorway of the theatre. A sob, the sound of it enticing, filled so with despair. As the door opened and a figure, head hung, shoulders slumped, stepped into the raw night, the man with the crooked leg knew that his search could wait, if only for a short while. The woman closed the door behind her, shawl and cloak quickly drenching, and headed off east, the wind at her back and working to trip her legs with the bottom of her cloak as it snapped like a pennant in a gale. Delicious sadness trailed her in a wake as pungent as any the man with the crooked leg had enjoyed since setting out from the wooded vale in the foothills. How could he refuse to help a heart tormented so? The chilling smile faded from his lips as he set out after the weeping woman. As he paced her, half obscured by the rain as it blew sideways in sheets, he opened his senses and marvelled. Most people's hearts, their true hearts, normally remained hidden, locked away, door after door, facade after facade, sometimes even sealed beyond their own reach. But she, well, if there'd ever been a lock, it had long since fallen away. If there'd ever been a door, it had been torn from its hinges. Perhaps she'd been one of the few cursed with no barriers whatsoever, her heart there for all to see, a target for every dart and wound the world had to offer. Given all that, then, it was little surprise that the woman sensed him almost immediately. Why, he could look over his shoulder and still see the front of the theatre. What he didn't expect was that she would turn on him. Where was her fear? Where even her common sense? All he felt was sadness. "What do you want?" she shouted. The man with the crooked leg limped to her. In the darkness, her pale face was drawn. He felt her essence, a scent so delicate, wash over him. He inhaled and paused. Beneath the heady grief was something else, a sharp, smoky spice. Also, hints of magic. He sniffed again. "Wonderful. I've had enough lunatics for this evening, thank you, sir," she said, turning. "Leave me be." He reached out and grabbed her arm. When she tried to pull away, he yanked her in close to him. His voice, little used, came out in a whisper, a stone dragged across gravel. "Where is he?" The woman fought, but the sadness tapped her strength and she let out a sob. "Just let me go, please, just let me go." "You saw him." She shook her head. "I don't know what you're talking about. Saw who?" He reached out and put his free hand to her face, touching her cheek lightly. There. Magic and dark eyes and a rich voice and a charcoal jacket and more magic. Glyphs and charms cloaking him in mirrored waves of disruption. Each soul had its own flavour, and the man with the crooked leg didn't mistake that of the sorcerer. "Thank you, darling," he said, his voice taking on an accent from the Midlands. He smiled once more. The woman stared at his face, recoiling. "I thought you were someone else. Forgive me. Best run along and get out of this wretched night. You'll catch your death." He relaxed his grip, his hand burning from the heat of her flesh, and stepped back. The woman stared at him, her gaze drifting from his mouth to his eyes. "Good night, sweetheart," he said. She shook her head, her face crumpling into tears. With one uncertain step, followed by another, she backed off, then turned and ran, glancing back more than once as she fled into the stormy darkness. The man with the crooked leg stood still, a statue carved in granite, an angel tombstone, a skull with wings watching over the dead, even as a strike of lightning broke the sky over the city, thunder muttering as London slept. Chapter 6. A Walled-in Garden. Rain dripped from cornice, lintel, slate and spire, even as the morning sun burned much of it to mist. Swaine shouldered his satchel and crossed into the great court of King's College. Students and professors passed along the paths, men such as he, focused on study. He wondered just how many of them were willing to dedicate a tenth of the effort he did. Not many, in all likelihood. He strained to imagine such a centre of learning dedicated to the unseen arts. A century, two, more. How long would it take before humanity might cede its superstitions and primitive urges? The world preferred the darkness of ignorance, he fully realized, and it would take more than a lone flame illuminating the future to sweep away the night. At the library, he whispered, "Fultume eftir fuchton, fiochton swadidon sie hefton, sendan maran fultum." Had anyone glanced at him in just that moment, he might have appeared to pass through a shadow, of a stray cloud perhaps, or maybe a flock of ravens overhead. Those who saw him on the other side would no longer see a gentleman in faded attire, but rather a younger man dressed in a scholar's gown, in bearing and appearance little different from those students nearby. By the time Swaine entered the library, no one would have recognized him. He made his way through the stacks and tables until he reached the desk tucked away by the stairs to the lower level. Phineas Hozier slumped before piles of books, staring at the wall. "Ah, the ever-industrious librarian, the very picture of vigour and verve," Swaine said. Hozier startled. "I beg your pardon?" Swaine, seeing no one else nearby, released the spell. Hozier's eyes widened. "Mr. Swaine." "Come to return Hill, as promised." Hozier looked at him as though decoding his words. "Is everything quite all right, Mr. Hozier?"
"Ah, the book, Hill. Yes, of course."
Still, he made no move to stand.
"She's dead, sir."
"I beg your pardon?"
"Catherine, she hung herself. Hanged herself."
The poor man's face wrinkled up, and he put a hand across his eyes. Swaine frowned. The actress, so vibrant, exuding life in her portrayal of Cordelia.
"And I can't help but think, that it was my fault,"
Hozier said. "Your fault? Why in the world would you think that?"
"She trusted me, sir, with her secrets, with her dreams."
"You seem to have gone from hoping not to make a fool of yourself to guardian of her secrets and dreams rather quickly."
"But that's just it. There was something there between us."
There'd been a magical enchantment between the two of them, a fact Swaine kindly refrained from pointing out. "You used all of the potion."
"Before 2 days and nights had passed."
Hozier lifted his gaze. The man looked positively haunted.
"That was the beauty of it, sir. Even after it had weakened, she still confided in me. So much. Telling me all about her cruel father, his death, trampled by a 4-horse team while in his cups, her aunt's household with her vile cousins, the eyes that watched her, the voices that she found inside. A trapped bird, she said, a trapped bird who sings of soaring over forests and foothills."
Hozier swallowed, the corners of his eyes quivering with tears.
"Sang, sir?"
His bony shoulders shook with grief and anguish, his sniffles breaking the quiet of the library. Swaine frowned. "You had no inkling that she was intent on taking her own life?"
"Of course not."
Hozier wiped his nose on the cuff of his sleeve.
"Otherwise I'd have kept her in my sight while she slept all throughout the day."
"Naturally." Swaine thought for a moment. "Was there any marked difference in her bearing from when you first approached her, with the magic, to be clear, versus when it weakened, or after?" The chances were quite low, but a certain type of person, one who teetered on the brink of madness, could be susceptible to exposure to various magics. Pushed over the edge, as it were, the flaws in their sanity finally sundering. With such a spell as what he'd incanted for Hozier, he didn't think such an outcome likely, yet the possibility couldn't be dismissed. Hozier shook his head.
"No, none. It was all like a dream, but better than anything I'd imagined. The first night we talked at the theatre for an hour. I escorted her home, where we stood outside her room and talked until nearly dawn, about everything. I nearly floated away as I walked home myself. She wanted to meet after the next afternoon's performance. That, of course, required a second application. Remembering what you'd said, my nerves had me by the scruff, I can fairly say, but it went even better than the night before. I had a knack for making her laugh, one that I'm not willing to say came from your work, begging your pardon. 'Twas the third night, the night before last, when I wondered if I'd ever even needed your help at all. Not that I hadn't needed it to begin with. Lord knows I tripped over my own tongue to the point of indecipherability, leaving me relegated to nothing more than the pity column in her ledgers, no doubt. But when the effect weakened and vanished, she didn't seem to notice. She told me, sir, she told me that she'd never felt listened to so well, ever. And isn't that just the most peculiar notion? An actress commanding the stage, commanding an audience, and she never felt listened to.
They weren't her words when she was on stage, were they?
That's a point indeed, sir, a right point, not her own. Well, she filled my ear with hers that night. And you might think I simply listened so well because I was so terrified of saying something foolish, but that's not the case. Not entirely, at least. I listened because her heart was right there, open. What she said was true. I can't put it any better than that.
I don't doubt you, Swaine said.
She bore hardships, sir, yet she turned them all into something beautiful, poured them all out through her art. She felt it all so deeply. As I listened to her, my own heart ached, as if I shared some of the weight of hers, if you follow. Now, it's not as you may be thinking. That's what I wanted all along, getting close to her, sneaking my way past her defences, all that. I don't rightly know what I wanted going in. All I knew is that I was content to see her eyes looking at mine, to stand near that beauty. But it changed, talking with her so. I saw her as a person, a walking, wounded, unique, beautiful spirit. It changed. I didn't want to, what's the way to say it, hunt for something, take something, possess some part of her. No, none of that. I only wanted to share something with her, a few moments, a few hours of honesty, honest talk, honest feelings, and we did. We both agreed. We'd discovered something, some space between us that neither of us expected, a walled-in garden we didn't know existed, but had room for both of us.
Under other circumstances, Swaine might have been tempted to discount Hozier's poetic colour as proof that the man was living more than half in his own imagination, driven by his own drought and thirst to rave about the beauty of a mirage on the unreachable horizon. But not in this case. The poor fellow was raw. Then I'm afraid I don't understand what happened, Swaine said.
Nor I, sir, nor I.
Hozier put his hand to his brow.
We were to meet in the morning. I was to help her retrieve a cedar trunk from her aunt's house in Shoreditch. She had a rehearsal at the theatre in the evening. All seemed fine, according to the other members of the troupe. She left late, though she wasn't the last to leave. No one saw her after that until her landlord found her in the stairwell of the building. A rope, sir, around the balustrade, and around her.
Yes, I see. It didn't sound to Swaine like anything having to do with the magic he'd created. That said, it struck him as it clearly struck Hozier. Peculiar. Why do something so rash, especially after appearing fine, even more than fine, by all those around her? True, a darkness could be well hidden, and who really knew what made sense or not within the context of a person willing to take their own life?
I'm crushed beyond all hope, sir,
Hozier said. He spoke the words with such melancholy that Swaine imagined he might physically disintegrate into the chair he sat in, dissolve into the floor of the dark corner of the library.
They're to inter her in a pauper's grave come tomorrow, and the company is scraping together what they can to get her a proper burial. I can't face it. Might as well rip my heart from my thin chest and bury it right along with her in the cold November soil.
The story didn't settle well with Swaine, though he supposed such stories likely didn't settle well with anyone involved. Still, Hozier had clearly never suffered such an improbable victory before, nor had it snatched away with such cruel finality. Meek though he was, more likely than not to blend in with whatever background he stood before, he was a kind and decent enough fellow. Listen to me, Mr. Hozier. Terrible as this is, you must find a way to keep going. For Catherine's sake, if your own doesn't feel strong enough right now. Swaine wasn't sure his words were the right ones to use. When it came to the unseen arts, he was as confident as a sea captain who'd plied all the world's oceans, reading the colour of the waves to predict a storm. When it came to people, however, he knew that logic mattered little, that intuition, his at any rate, often as not put him at cross-purpose to what society recommended. A room full of books, planar energy harnessed, glamours cast and demons summoned made infinitely more sense to him than any public room in any tavern in London and all the murky expectations of the people who might fill it. "I'm truly sorry for your loss, my good man," he added. Oh, there went the weeping again. Hozier's shoulders heaved in great spasms, while various fluids seeped out from beneath the palms he pressed to his face. Swaine held his hand out, pulled it back, and finally settled for patting the man on the shoulder yet again. It worked significantly less well than a spell might have, as far as he could tell. Chapter 7. Harmonious Entrainment. Later, Swaine looked up from his notes, startled to realize that midnight loomed. He reached for the teacup only to find it long drained, as was the kettle, and both cold to the touch. Ink speckled the fingers and thumbs of his left hand, and the nib of the quill had dulled. He'd laid the quill down and blotted the notes he'd made. Never enough hours. Or tea. Hill hadn't helped. As far as Swaine was concerned, the man's genius was obvious. His ability to get to the point, however, much less so. It was as though the man proffered a detailed account of the role of a castle in a medieval town, yet infuriatingly omitted any of the following words: castle, stone, parapet, bridge, crenel, tower, liege, barbican, or keep. For a work purporting to bring special insight into the curious relationship between alchemical interactions and recombinant elemental energies, Hill spent precious little time actually describing how either alchemical interactions or recombinant elemental energies might interact with the other. Yet the work lingered in Swaine's thoughts. Hill had baffled a century's worth of scholars, so why not him? Having written out his own thoughts on the matter, Swaine felt no closer to understanding than when he'd sat down at his desk 5 hours earlier. Maybe the work simply lingered in his mind as the quills of a porcupine might linger in the mouth of an unwitting hound, leaving him out 20 quid for the privilege. He stood and stretched. His tin of tea leaves was down to scraps and dust. The clock on the mantel ticked, taunting him. Seconds, minutes, hours, days, all might vanish down a hole chasing a genius like Hill. He begrudged the time lost worse than the money. He could always make more money, but the sand in the hourglass only ever disappeared. If only he had 5 of himself. He sighed as he stretched his neck, raising arms overhead, clenching and unclenching his fingers. The thought amused him. One of him could wrestle with Hill's notion of concentrated harmonies of parallel substrates, while another could scour the bundle of yellowed rolls of paper he'd purchased from a merchant in Munich in search of elusive names of demons. A third could experiment with the variations of the glyphs he'd identified as strong enough for the new styles of glamours he'd conceived of. A fourth could practice the 17th ward in Angus Hume's majestic translation of Grimhilda's Sravobis Ravasius, a particularly vexing protection against the infernal, as a 5th August Swaine could titrate the Penniless Laricus that he'd acquired from Hambley and Harrick's Far East Trading Company the fortnight before, and which had sat carefully protected within a magicked box deep in one of his trunks of ingredients. Put them all in harmonious entrainment, as Hill would say. Swaine gazed out of the window at the moon over London. Of course, 5 of him would require 5 times the energy. From his rooms he could just make out the Thames. With enough of a power source, the energy could be channeled, he supposed. And if each version of himself concentrated the substrates of such energy, allowing for more energy to be harnessed for the subsequent instances. The smile on his face disappeared, whimsy evaporating in a flash of insight. It would work with demons. In fact, it had worked with a demon not 3 months earlier, leaving him stumped and puzzled, unable to explain what he'd done. With certainty, Swaine knew he'd unlocked a mystery in an instant. Not that Hill had mentioned demons once. The man had been a magician, not a sorcerer. Still, the principle ought to be the same in dealing with energies forced into parallel entrainment. And what was the binding of a demon if not another form of concentrated substrate? By God, that was it! The pieces clicked into place, a planar confluence such as found in the village of Hagen, Norway. Abundant energies there for the tapping, a serial harnessing of demonic strength. Swaine felt his way through the logic, knowing even then that he'd wandered past the leading edge of sorcery's prior achievements. Swaine turned back to his writing desk, sweeping aside his notes on Hill, grabbing a fresh quill and paper. He dipped the quill and held it above the blank page. What am I missing? That was the key, wasn't it? Easy enough to spot a flaw in the material before one's eyes. The real skill was in identifying what wasn't even there and ought to be. He closed his eyes, concentrating his own thoughts. After a while, he scratched out his thoughts, his hand struggling to keep up with the ideas that poured forth. Hours later, his curtains proved no match for the strong morning sunlight. When Swaine stirred, he didn't begrudge the chunk of sleep that had been devoured by his insight. In fact, he still felt the surge of excitement, worth any number of kettles of tea. He ran a hand over his face, pushing aside the hair across his eyes. Such a peculiar feat, having a flash of unexpected acumen. Swaine thought it akin to discovering a hidden doorway, one that might well have been passed by without notice 1,000 times, but for an alignment of circumstance that couldn't be anticipated or repeated. If he hadn't been at Punchard's bookshop on Piccadilly earlier in the year at precisely the moment he had, he'd never have met Hozier. If he'd never have met Hozier, he wouldn't have learned of the Secret Acts collection at the library. If he hadn't learned of that, he'd never have gotten his hands on Hill. If he hadn't been wrestling with Hill's labyrinthine exposition on harmonious entrainment at nearly the same time he'd been thinking about the mystery of how he'd bound an unknown demon in Hagen 3 months earlier, well, he was quite prepared to give luck its due. The difference between the merely lucky and the successful, however, well, that required a certain genius.
We discovered something, some space between us that neither of us expected, a walled-in garden we didn't know existed, but had room for both of us.
Swaine recalled the words of poor Hozier. Had it been a similar feeling between Hozier and the doomed actress? Of course. Uncovering a future where none had been apparent, discovering a connection, a profound, electrifying connection that changed all that came before it. He supposed it must have been the same for Hozier at least. Sitting up, he wondered again about the woman, the actress. She must not have felt the same, despite Hozier's protests to the contrary. Otherwise, why take her own life?
The eyes that watched her, the voices that she found inside. A trapped bird, she said, a trapped bird who sings of soaring over forests and foothills.
As Swaine reached for his breeches, he paused, recalling what Hozier had said the actress had told him. A trapped bird who sings of soaring over forests and foothills. He'd heard those words before, though not in English. Maybe that was why he hadn't registered them the moment Hozier relayed them. Maybe it was the shock of hearing of the actress's suicide, or the need to comfort Hozier in his despair. The shock fell across Swaine like ice water. He scrambled off his bed and rushed into the next room to crouch before one of the many bookcases, the one where he kept the volumes of his summoning notes. Chapter 8. The Demise of Hagen. 3 months earlier. Climbing over a tumbled stone wall of what had once been a churchyard, a 6-foot spar of iron tore from an old gate and hurtled at Swaine's head. With a snap of his arms, he deflected the spar with a spell, sending it clanging across a slanted headstone. Before the metallic racket ceased, however, half of the headstone cracked apart and shot at him like a cannonball. He only had time to drop to the ground, missing having his head taken off by the merest of inches. Lifting his head, he felt a surge of gratitude. The trip had been worth it. Scanning the remnants of the village of Hagen, huddled along the eaves of the pine forest, he wondered what sort of fiend he was dealing with. Rotted roofs had given way beneath nearly a century of abandonment. Wind and rain and sun gnawed away the remaining wood, earth stains and mildew claiming the rest. Timbers canted like the ribs of dead beasts picked clean. Chimneys and stone foundations appeared little different from the granite markers lurking beneath moss and lichen in the old cemetery. Beyond rose the wooded hills of Krokskogen. Swaine had left Oslo 3 days earlier, following sparsely marked roads on horseback, questioning the wisdom of extending his book-buying trip on the continent in order to chase down a rumour supported by little more than guesswork. The account of the demise of Hagen was once well known enough to have been remarked upon by Pope Innocent XI in an encyclical titled Nequid obrepit Satanasus, as evidence of the encroachment of Satan into the realm of believers. To Swaine's eye, the original incident, a sorcerer losing control of a powerful demon, the demon possessing the sorcerer's grandchild, the possessed child murdering the sorcerer's family and most of the village in one bloody spree, wasn't particularly noteworthy, save for the number of those killed. Lifting the tale from the ghastly wreckage of sorcery's long history of deadly failures, however, was the possibility of the demon in question having been an arch-fiend. Better still, an arch-fiend still troubling the forested hills 97 years after the fact. In the decade after the incident, the small villages near Hagen bled themselves dry of inhabitants. Talk of a curse took root. Those who could left. Those who couldn't, or wouldn't, endured for a time until, handful by handful, individual by individual, they all passed on. Some died, while others vanished, never heard from again. People in the nearby valley avoided the roads that led to Hagen, and the forest around it gained a reputation as home to ravenous shades ready to waylay travellers, luring them into the lonesome dells with sweet whispers. Still, nothing any run-of-the-mill demon couldn't be capable of. The story piqued Swaine's interest, however, when he came across accounts of a well-regarded German magician by the name of Heinrich Flüsse having explored the area in the mid-17th century and amassing a number of compelling readings indicating disturbances in the unseen planar energies converging on Hagen, disturbances of a scale beyond that which might be explained by a demon of the more common strain. As Swaine got cautiously to his feet, whispers and screams erupted all around. He hurried by the tumbled church, noting stenches, marked shifts in temperature, shadows seen only in the corner of his eyes. By the time he reached a safe corner of the ruins to shield himself, a rusted bell from the slanting steeple flew at him, taking out 6 bricks, stinging his face with shards of mortar and stone, leaving his ears ringing. A potent demon indeed. Keeping himself protected as well as he could with a number of wards, he crouched and darted along the length of the church. Not far off stood a cabin in better shape than the other buildings he'd scouted, so he sprinted for that, dodging a series of projectiles, including an assortment of cutlery, animal bones, and enough stones to build a respectable field wall. Crashing in through the cabin door, he slid on a spray of old leaves and lost his footing, slamming down on one knee with a grunt. Before he'd even stopped his tumble, he swept the satchel off his shoulder and poured out the materials he'd need to ready the room for the summoning. Hands steady, he installed specialized glyphs in the doorway and on the windowsills, moving quickly. Once that was done, he cast a series of sealing spells along the 4 cardinal directions just inside the walls. The mayhem continued outside, rock and branch banging against the planks with tremendous force, but he knew he was, for the moment, safe. Slowing his breathing, he instantiated 7 glamours across the floor, concentric circles alternating magic dash and iron filings imbued with powerful spells of protection. Inside the innermost circle, he placed a small steel key. The only clue, in retrospect, he'd embarked on the most perilous summoning of his career was the strange way in which his shadow doubled and trebled across the floor for brief moments. The low, slanting rays of the late summer sunset came in through the open doorway and missing windows, leaving his shadow to stretch across the floor and up the walls. He studied the peculiar effect on his shadow, but dismissed it as some form of unexpected interplay between his precautions. Silence from outside. Swaine cocked his head, listening. "You're curious now, aren't you?" he whispered. "Well, wait and see what I have in store for you." Readying his ingredients, Swaine soon began the summoning, following the traditional structure designed to maximize both the focus of his mind and the potency of the spells of binding. Known as the keystone of the infernal, The process is divided into sections, each of which performs a specific function in the subjugation of the demon's will. As he recited the first canto, he felt the familiar shift in awareness brought about by a demonic summoning. One part intense concentration, one part expansion of consciousness, as though the world both sharpened and loosened at the same time. The words he spoke fell flat in the still air of the cabin, but as he continued, some of them took flight, sounding as if spoken in a large stone chamber, echoing queerly. He sensed an unevenness to the canto, strange lulls where the growing strength of the incantations flagged, grew slack. By the time he reached the first speaking of the demon's name, the section known as the Nomino Daemonium, he knew the energies in the cabin were far from normal. The moment he spoke the name gleaned from the accounts, Svaradaranava, he recoiled, his voice crackled like blazing fire in his ears, and smoke poured from his broiling mouth. The cloying stench of burning feces filled his nostrils. Though he'd never experienced it before, he recognized the phenomenon immediately, vox satanus, or Satan's voice. In effect, a proximity-based curse, the vox satanus was a defensive magic of certain demons meant to deter the speaking of their name, that irresistible lure that drew them into the trap the sorcerer set. Swaine gasped and waved away the smoke, spitting and wiping his mouth, continuing the summoning. While the effect of vox satanus was disconcerting, it did little in the way of damage to the summoner's mouth, serving mainly as a distraction. So he continued, moving into the section known as the stitching of the name, wherein he repeated the name of Svaradalanava 13 times, each time stepping counterclockwise around the circumference of the binding glamour he laid out on the floor. Smoke filled the cabin, roiling from Swaine's mouth. Each repetition increased the sound of the blaze in his ears until he heard little else. In fact, his ears would ring for days afterwards, and it would be even longer before the smell of soot left his nose. Upon the final invocation of the demon's name, the lines of iron filings lit up with a dull gold, the illumination shifting and brightening as though heated in a forge. Above the circle, the air shimmered. The demon manifested, unseen. All around the cabin wood creaked as boards strained, as the pegs in the beams squealed, as the stones of the hearth cracked. Yet none of it, all potential weapons the demon might hurl at Swaine, gave way, protected by the glyph work he'd enchanted throughout. Frigid currents of air flowed around him, sending his skin prickling into gooseflesh, tightening his scalp. Swaine ignored it all and readied the first incantation of the summoning's next section. For that, he needed to create what was known as shadow lock, the first step in the lengthy binding process. He turned to the quartet of candles he'd readied. One at a time, he lifted the candles and coaxed a flame to the wick with the word ignis, placing them at the cardinal points along the glamour. As he spoke the first lines of the incantation, the demon shrieked, a high, piercing sound that came from everywhere and nowhere, loud enough to send thin spills of dust from the decrepit ceiling falling through the fading light of dusk. Swaine ignored it. The fiend could shriek all it wanted to. It wasn't going anywhere. In fact, Swaine preferred the demon fuss demonstrably. It made the remainder of the binding easier, as it made it possible to read the demon's stratagems without doubt. Of all possible opening gambits, the only one Swaine dreaded was known as stillness of the silent heart, wherein a subtle fiend would make no sign whatsoever that it had arrived, not a breeze, not a chill, not a whisper. Nothing. With no reveal, the summoner was left to carry on with the binding as though alone in a room, and in the silence, a ruinous seed of doubt could take root in the sorcerer's mind that might lead to a misstep. Doubt was the true bane of sorcerers. No, he'd much rather the demon make its dismay at being summoned apparent from the start. While the demon grunted, hissed, screamed, and panted, Swaine proceeded methodically through the steps of the binding. He ended the stitching of the name without incident, satisfied to see the lines of ash lift off the floorboards and turn slowly within the circle of glowing iron. The first half of the next incantation, a lengthy recital of 16 couplets designed to locate the contours of the demon's will, went well, but when he reached the 9th couplet, a wave of vertigo came over him. Such a sensation wasn't altogether uncommon in sorcery. The phenomenon was known as leaning past the beyond and was related to an incursion of planar forces during an active incantation. Such energies had the power to turn the spells crooked, distorting the careful magical underpinnings as they're spoken. Worse, it could be an indication that the demon has found a purchase in a different plane in an attempt to wrench itself free. Swaine fought the urge to steady himself. His eyes wanted to roll as he found himself looking at the glamours as though they were on a vertical wall where he stood, about to slide and collapse onto them. The feeling raced up and down his body, wanting to pitch him forward. Worse, it sent a reflexive jolt of panic through him. At that very moment, one of the 4 candles flew across the cabin as though struck with a mallet. Swaine froze. This far along in the binding, the demon shouldn't be capable of such disruption, contained as it was within the activated glamours. Worse, the balance of the magic he'd put in place was disturbed, which would only allow for more such malicious efforts by Svaradalanauer. Before he had time to even consider any further ramifications, the lines of iron filings flared gold and then white, and lifted sideways on end like a spare wagon wheel stood up on its tread. The air between this new alignment of the iron glamour and the ash glamour, still on the floor where he'd created it, crackled with strands of miniature lightning, bursting and snapping, reaching out and jolting anything metal within the cabin. The instruments within Swaine's haversack, the buckles on his shoes, the pendant and chain around his neck. "Aufhören, höllischer Teufel!" he shouted, using the German version of the most powerful ward against planar intrusion he knew. "Ich entgib dich in Eisen, wirf dich zurück in Escher, binde deinen Willen, binde deine Kräfte, binde deine schlechten Bemühungen." Strands of lightning pushed away from him in a corona as he neared the disrupted glamours, holding his right palm out in front of him. His hair snapped and his sleeves clung to his skin. Crouching by the corner of the binding circle, he lifted his other hand. "Lucana Mare!" The deposed candle flew across the room and into his outstretched hand. Repeating the incantation, he slammed the candle back into place. Flames leapt from the other 3 candles to the wick of the 4th, fire and lightning dancing in the air. Swaine strained against the massive energies until he felt the power of the bindings lock back into place. Before he could as much as congratulate himself, a tremendous weight crashed into him, sending him splaying out into the binding circle. To break the integrity of the glamours was bad enough, but having been caught unawares left Swaine stunned for a critical few moments. Before he could speak any defensive words, unseen hands wrenched him into the air, stretching and pulling his limbs. "Aletan Firnskeda," he began, only to have the phrase cut painfully short as he was slammed to the floor so hard that he couldn't even grunt. No air remained in his lungs. The front of his shirt shredded, claws, or teeth, slicing into his flesh. 6 a dozen, then a dozen cruel strokes across his chest. Unable to speak, he reached up and tore the pendant from his throat. By clenching the charm in his fist, the ward within activated, a last-ditch protection. A sphere of potent sorcery burst from his closed hand, hurling the demon away from him. The flames on the candles flared, stretching 1/2 foot in height. Swaine groaned as he rolled to his side, holding the warded pendant aloft. Magic flared, tracing the sagging ceiling, the warped boards, the stones in the hearth with thin lines of binding white and yellow that curled and shimmered. Even as Swaine sucked in a thin breath, his gaze snapped to the corner of the cabin. 2 grotesque shapes crouched. Long, lean, and jointed in peculiar fashion, the true shapes of the demons, plural, for there were 2, revealed themselves against the blast of Swaine's ward. 2. The problem came clear to Swaine instantly. Svaradalanauer had been summoned, yet another had appeared with him, perhaps drawn in by Swaine's presence, perhaps wandered out of the planar confluences that the village appeared riven with. It made little difference at the moment. Swaine pushed himself to his feet, managing to fill his lungs with blessed air. His mind ticked through the peril. Svaradalanauer was problem enough, the binding disrupted. All wasn't lost, but Swaine needed to hurry. The second demon was, potentially, a larger problem. It could be anything from an annoying imp to a higher entity of dreadful bearing. Holding the ward aloft, Swaine staggered out of the glamours towards the demons. "Svaradalanava!" he shouted. Even saying the demon's name told him much of the binding held. Waves of shivers rolled up and down the demon's limbs and along his torso, the physical manifestation of the subjugation of infernal will. The demon stretched to full height, still stooping beneath the ceiling, but filling the corner of the cabin. 7 elongated appendages spread out. Swaine kept most of his attention on Svaradalanava while tracking the movements of the second demon, who had, so far, remained motionless. Whether out of fear or about to pounce, Swaine could only guess. His gaze flicking back and forth between the two fiends, he positioned himself at the terminal apex of the glamours on the floor. The combination of magic within the summoning circle provided some degree of safety in that one spot, by design. He paused, feeling as though he held an asp by the tail in each hand. One wrong move was death, and he needed both hands to subdue either serpent. Keeping the pendant raised at the unknown demon, he spoke the next couplet of the binding. Svaradalanava resisted the lure of the binding, shifting back and forth almost quicker than Swaine's eyes could track, smashing at the walls from the corner. A terrible howl rose, higher and higher in pitch. As Swaine shouted the incantation, the lines of magic faded and the outlines of the demons faded back into the shadows. Swaine kept gazing around the darkened cabin. He tried not to let the fear of the second demon break his concentration on the binding. It didn't work. The back of Swaine's neck rippled. He expected another charge at any moment. A candle, board or brick flung at his face, more rending, clawing, tearing. Not the proper state of mind to bind a demon, not at all. Still, half in already, he had no choice but to continue or risk an even worse outcome. Bringing his focus down to the words of the second canto, he pushed all other thoughts out of his mind. A breeze rippled past him. "Won't you help me?" The voice speaking from just behind him was high and frightened, a child. It came from the hearth. "I'm so frightened. I'm nothing but a trapped bird who sings of soaring over forests and foothills." Swaine didn't pause the incantation. The sound of disconsolate weeping filled the cabin. At least the second demon wasn't assaulting him at the moment. As he finished the final couplet, the magic of the glamours flared, revealing the presence of the demon within the circle once again. Better still, he felt the connection of the demon's mind, the binding to his will established. If the other demon knew what was going on, this would be the instant to attack, for this moment was the time of peak vulnerability for the summoner. If the demon wasn't driven into submission, relentlessly, vigorously, without yielding an inch of ground, the channel between the sorcerer and the fiend could be used in the other direction, allowing the demon to subsume the will of the sorcerer. The structure of the binding relied on the reintroduction of the same forces that lured and snared the demon in the first place, all designed to add an unstoppable momentum to the final steps of the binding. All he had to do was release the glamoured wards and claws raked the back of his legs, splitting the material of his breeches at his calves, sending blood flying out across the floor. The pain was immediate, stinging, yet Swaine kept his focus on the binding, pushing aside all other reactions, relying on the willpower he'd developed over a decade. A vast shadow whirled around the outside of the glamour, nudging in, pulling back, circling around for another strike. Swaine turned, whispering the spell, not pausing. Each syllable brought forth a glare from the circle of ash, one segment at a time, until the entire line blazed. Svaradalanava resisted, his howls of frustration bursting in Swaine's mind, but the glamours pressed in on the demon from all directions. Svaradalanava heaved back at him, and their wills locked. Nothing else registered for Swaine. Not the pain in his chest and legs, not the second demon pressing ever closer, not the plummeting temperature that stung his eyes and made his fingers burn with cold, setting his stomach and chest to shivering. So he stood, arms outstretched, gazing into the centre of the glamours, still as though cast in bronze. Yet, for all the outward dispassion and repose of the scene, Swaine fought furiously with Svaradalanava in full contact with the demon's mind. Each opening countered, each feint blocked, each thrust, sweep, slash, met and parried. lulls, withdrawals, shifts, swerves, reverses, threats, promises, pleading, all followed, all leveraged, all deflected. Minutes meant nothing, for though the hand on his watch barely swept through half a dozen of them, each moment of engagement with the fiend refracted into a spectrum of awareness as light expanded by a prism. Seconds folded in on themselves, revealing deeper layers of the demon's will. Swaine followed everything the demon did, not letting it retreat, blocking its attacks. After crossing the moment where he felt he couldn't maintain the effort needed, Swaine felt it. The instant Svaradalanava surrendered. Into that sudden void, he spoke the incantation known as the golden spike of shackling. And there it was, the sensation of the demon shrinking down, 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 encased in Swaine's own sorcery. The feeling never failed to amaze him, akin to pressing hard against a wall only to have it transform into a thin plate of tin, then a canvas sail full of wind, then a silken sheet, then a cocoon, then nothing more than a mist, all in under a second. But in that moment, the mental lurch forward, all that effort finding no more resistance, the second demon struck. Not content with slashing at Swaine's flesh, the unknown fiend tried to leap into his mind. Swaine cried out. Shadows bloomed behind his eyelids, and he felt the intolerable defilement of demonic will flooding his thoughts. He leaped backward, his voice, already hoarse from the summoning and binding, cracking as he yelled out Hume's 11th ward, the ward of trespass. The demon fled his mind, though not without a ghastly scraping, as though claws tore at the inside of Swaine's skull. Swaine cried out, grabbing at his head. The demon swept up all the broken, mouldered slats and boards in the cabin and shoved them at Swaine, following with a ferocious attack. Swaine stumbled into the glamour on the floor, landing on his back, knocking over the candle on the northern side of the circle, smearing ash and metal filings, feeling the brass key dig into his back. The demon smothered him, shadows and flashes of deep red crushing him into the floor. Tendrils of malign intent looked for ways into his thoughts. Swaine opened his mouth to shout another ward. The demon wrenched Swaine's own hand up and into his mouth, gagging him, shoving it against his teeth, filling his mouth with the iron tang of his own blood. It was no good. He couldn't speak the ward. The horror of the end shook Swaine. This was how he would die. The exigency of sorcery claiming another victim. All his preparations and study failing him in the face of a terrible collection of circumstance, pushing him from the precipice of life into oblivion. He grabbed, desperate, at the only thing he could, Svaradalanava. The demon, likely unsure of its new limits and confused by the binding, hesitated. "Pull him from me, use all your strength," Swaine commanded wordlessly. The two demons tore at each other above Swaine, filling the air with shrieks and howls, sharp gusts of wind and a stinging charge of electricity. He felt Svaradalanava pull the unknown demon into a cruel embrace, bending his own will against the demon. Swaine ripped his hand free from his mouth. Ignoring the blood, he repeated the golden spike of shackling, some curious intuition welling up inside him. As he did, the light of the displaced glamours blazed. The second demon joined Svaradalanava in the key, which rang with a lone metallic note, then stilled. Pale light spread in ripples across the inside of the cabin, growing brighter and brighter until every plank, beam and stone revealed every last detail. Swaine squinted, shading his eyes. Wind shrieked in the hearth and through the missing windows. A massive eruption of planar energy poured down over the glamours. The cabin filled with the screams of the second demon, and then the sound ceased, cut off. At the same moment, the ceiling creaked and shuddered, the wood groaning as it gave way. Swaine crouched by the stones of the fireplace, hands over his head as board and beam crashed into the centre of the space, bringing in half the turf atop the cabin with it. Clods of dirt smacked his shoulders. Dust filled his nose. After half a minute, the collapse ceased, reduced to trickles of grit. Swaine lowered his hands and raised his head. Looking up, he saw stars glinting in the heavens. The worst of the damage missed him, thankfully. Shrugging off debris, he got to his feet and raised his hands, a ward ready on his tongue should the stray demon have eluded capture. Nothing. As he extended his sorcerous senses, he felt no infernal presence. He lowered his arms. If he'd been in the wrong spot, he'd have been gravely injured, crippled perhaps, or even killed. Well, if he'd wanted a safe and dull life, he could have become a lawyer like his wretched father. He brushed the dust and dirt from his shoulders and stood. Swaine pushed his way through the collapsed timbers of the roof, grunting each time he strained with the joists, his ribs complaining with each breath, each contraction of his muscles. The glamours held, thankfully. As he reached the centre of them, he felt around until his fingers closed over the key. Frigid to the touch, he nonetheless held it tight in his fist. He paused so, on his knees, panting, the exhilaration of a successful binding washing over him. He thought about what he'd done. 2, he whispered. 2 demons bound at once, together, one known or suspected, and the other a random infernal intruder. But how? He worked his way through the implications, even as dusk sunk into night and the stars blinked alive in the sky open above the cabin. It was only when the dripping of blood onto the floor in front of him registered that he noticed the slashes across his chest. He put his free hand to his tattered shirt and waistcoat, shocked at how sodden they were. Warm blood ran between his fingers. He got to his feet, steadying himself on the weathered wood. Scratches would heal. Cuts could be stitched shut. But a breakthrough as he'd just experienced. A price he'd happily pay again. Chapter 9. Blossoms of Flame. As the dark figure of Swaine, a shade in the starlit night, passed off into the old road and into the forest's edge, a quiet voice in the cabin, the voice of a child, sang a lullaby. Softly at first, then growing in volume, broken here and there with giggles, the song drifted out into the night. Soon, blossoms of flame sprouted in the corners of the fallen cabin. The dried wood caught quickly. Soon the flames climbed the walls and engulfed the roof as though hungry for the stars themselves. The lullaby continued, sweet and dark. Chapter 10. Stony ground indeed. The lock rattled, the iron alive. A satisfying nick sounded, and Swaine pushed the tall door inward. The spell unwound in moments, leaving a rime of frost on the outside of the lock as the tumblers righted themselves. He paused inside the transept of the church. The sound of the door closing behind him grew into the dark space of the nave. Stained glass windows appeared dull in the midnight. Scarlets, pale yellows, and deep azure reduced to colours of morning, grey, black, leaden. Just as well as far as Swaine was concerned. Images of apostles, shrubby crowns, and haloed executions left him cold, even at their most colourful. He whispered a small incantation. A shimmer of white bloomed in the air above his outstretched palm. Enough light to see by, not enough to draw the attention of any of the city's constables or guard, should they glance in the direction of the fog-shrouded Christ Church on Newgate Street, as he searched for the coffin of Catherine Nunn. Hozier had confirmed the efforts by the company to keep the actress from a pauper's grave had been sufficiently successful enough to get her a proper burial. And not just any burial. One of the company's benefactors had prevailed upon his brother-in-law, the vicar apostolic of the London district, to hold the funeral in Christchurch, where the coffin allegedly resided. Unlikely as it was that the tragic suicide of Madame Nunn was linked to the nearly fatal and breakthrough summoning he'd performed in Heggen, the phrase she'd uttered, a trapped bird who sings of soaring over forests and foothills, was altogether too close to the unusual whispers hurled at him by a demon. Probably coincidence, however unlikely. Still, he had to investigate even the possibility. One didn't trifle with demons. To Swaine, precaution was 90% of sorcery. He peered into the nave. Row upon row of wooden pews stretched beneath the arched ceilings. The aisle ran the length of the enormous room, mirrored by a second one on the opposite side. Following the aisle towards the raised choir and apse, he held his hand aloft. As he suspected, The coffin wasn't already laid out atop a bier. She was an actress after all, not a person of proper standing. Beyond a small chapel with an auxiliary altar, he found the doorway leading down into the crypt where he guessed the coffin resided. The stone walls exhaled a dank chill as he followed the narrow stairs deeper into the darkness. At the bottom stood another locked door. This time he used a spell known as Hands of the Rattle Thief. It required a different form of conjury from the magic he'd used on the door into the church, and would therefore retain an unalloyed strength. Repetitions of the same spell quickly diminished in potency. Nor was he eager for the accompanying headache such repetitions inevitably brought about. He whispered the words of incantation. With each instance of the phrasing, the door vibrated more strongly until it hammered on the hinges like a bridge beneath a passing company of cavalry. Swaine went silent, holding his free hand an inch above the vibrating wood. He placed his palm on the door. The door fell silent and swung open. Cool air rushed out over him, carrying the musty scent of the tomb. Swaine stepped through the doorway. Nunn's coffin lay alongside the wall to his left, raised upon a pair of thick boards. Swaine allowed the light in his hand to brighten. Beyond the alcove, just inside the door, arched passageways and thick stone vaults extended into the darkness. Puddles dampened the corners. The various skulls and skeletons sleeping in the black took no notice of their new visitor, as far as Swaine could tell. He turned to the coffin. Ropes draped either end, ready for the workers who would carry it up prior to the service. Swaine pushed them aside. Feeling along the edge of the lid, he located the 4 nails that sealed it shut. Another spell could pull the nails from their embedded state, but so could the steel pry bar he'd brought along. Too many spells in one night would leave him weak and cringing at the faintest light for most of the next day. He felt inside the satchel he wore and pulled out the bar. Working it along one side, then the next, he loosened the coffin lid. The groan of the nails and wood wavered off into the crypts. Once he pried up the last corner, he stowed the bar back into his satchel and lifted the lid, setting it on end by the foot of the coffin. He wrinkled his nose at the stench of decay that lolled from the interior. Holding his hand over the coffin, he frowned. There it was, the reason for the church, the reason for religion, the reason for every tale of the afterlife, the reason for half of what humanity had done since the first light of civilization had broken over the mists of time. Catherine Nunn looked like a statue. A bloated, sallow statue, her once beautiful face thrown back in a silent, frozen gasp, her head wrenched unnaturally to one side from the damage of the rope she'd hanged herself with. However many roles she'd played in life, they'd all been working up to this, her final part. Swaine, having seen more than a few corpses in his studies of the unseen arts, thought she played it better than most. Perhaps the poor woman would have been pleased to hear it. Then again, all the applause of London hadn't been enough to sufficiently tether her to life, so maybe her heart had been stony ground indeed, no matter what magic she'd worked on the boards. Swaine covered his nose with the cuff of his sleeve and leaned over the body. No signs of disturbance. Hands, pale as wax candles, folded one on another. Bloated middle. Ankles demurely aligned beyond the hem of her burial gown. The best we might all hope for, he thought with a sigh. Dressed, posed, boxed up, and ready for an hour-long ceremony before being lowered into the soil, where our memory might well fade more quickly than the bones would return to dust. No, none had it as well as any, and all that implied. Drive, accrual, station, respect, love, no amount could stave off the full stop at the end of the sentence that was life. And what did the world do about the ever-present anticipation of reaching the end of the sentence? Shrink away beneath their sheets like children frightened by thunder, primly recite platitudes like students before their stern professors, claim certainty, all the while shaking their heads and squeezing their eyes shut. All well and good if one lacked the verve to actually plunge into the mystery. None of that would do for Swaine, however, which perhaps went some distance to explaining why he stood peering into a coffin while the bulk of London slept peacefully. He snapped out of the reverie and reached into his satchel. He pulled out a wide candle and lit it with his tinderbox, balancing it on Nun's chest. "Never fear, this won't hurt a bit," he whispered. With his hands once again free, he retrieved a stoppered flask from his satchel and held it before him. Popping open the flask, he poured a thin stream of oil over her forehead and throat. When he slid aside the lid of a small wooden box and sprinkled the mixture of ground minerals so that it landed in the lines of the oil, the combination of ingredients flared a deep rust colour, the final light of day. The flame on the candle fluttered on the wind that rose from the darkened crypts behind him. Ghostly sighs echoed from the arched passages, the still air disturbed for the first time in decades, maybe longer. In the shifting light of the glamoured lines of magic and the snapping flame, Swaine spoke the octet of lines of the spell, the divination of spectral fingerprints. A rather blunt tool, it could potentially save him the trouble of a more complex test for signs of demonic influence. Corpses could be tricky. Some might yield their secrets with hardly a nudge, others might remain in one particular state or another, refusing anything definitive even as the incantations grew more and more exotic. As the words flowed, Swaine's concentration deepened until only the corpse and his magic existed to him. Each syllable took on more weight, the contours of sound matching the intent he filled it with. Once reaching the end of the final repetition, the incantation required 3 full passes. A shudder passed through the lifeless limbs of Nun, heels and head banging on the boards of the coffin. Swaine scanned the corpse for telltale hints of illumination, proclaiming a touch of the infernal. Nothing. He watched for another quarter of an hour as the magic dissipated from the glamouring like embers fading to ash. Still nothing. So good so far. While such a test proclaimed with near certainty that the poor woman hadn't counted demonic infestation among her troubles, Swaine wasn't entirely satisfied. Corpses, after all. Crouching, he felt through his satchel until he found the small compass-like device known as a calibrated enharmonic gauge. While not designed to reveal the presence of demons per se, it was extremely sensitive to fluctuations in the unseen planes, capable of registering even the slight disturbances, wakes, if you will, left by infernal entities. Instantiating the proper conductivity by holding it in the palm of his left hand while passing his right hand above it and reciting the activation spell, he watched as the dual-armed needle within the glamoured oils trapped in the glass stirred to movement, sweeping in counterclockwise circles at an accelerating pace. Soon the needle was no more than a blur. It felt alive in Swaine's palm as he held it out over the corpse, moving it carefully from her head to her toes. Seeing no deviations, he slowly paced the coffin itself. The air crackled as hidden threads of energy that crisscrossed the planes snapped and zinged like minuscule, unseen bolts of lightning. Nothing broke the steady whir within the glass. "Well, Madam Nun," he said, returning to where he began, "it appears that your demons were sadly your own. I only wish I could have done something about those. You were a true artist." He was about to put away the device when it twisted in his hand, a gyroscopic force laying claim to the spinning needle. Sounds from the top of the stairs echoed out into the cathedral above. A thudding step, a sliding scuff, a step, a scuff, step, scuff, step, scuff. As the steps neared the head of the stairs, a faint whistling came clear, tracing a simple tune. A lullaby. "Stepan," Swaine spoke. The candle atop the corpse extinguished. Darkness swallowed the crypt. As the intruder drew to the top of the stairs, the gauge in Swaine's hand went wild. He had to clamp his fingers down tight to hold it in place, and even then it fought to fly from his grip. The footsteps and whistling stopped. Swaine listened, not moving. "I feel you down there, my friend." The words floated down over the steps, amplified by the stone of the walls, scurrying off into the passages behind Swaine. He didn't recognize the voice, dry like the inside of a cedar trunk seasoned by decades in a forgotten attic, but noted no accent that might mark the visitor as anyone who hadn't grown up in Lincoln, where Swaine himself had been raised. "Your sorcery entices me once again." The frown on Swaine's face deepened. He held his tongue, resisting the urge to step back into the empty passages behind him, to flee.
Come. No need to be as silent as your unfortunate companion. You know I'm here. I know you're there. It's time we got better acquainted, don't you think?
Swaine moved his hand above the gauge and its motion ceased. He slipped it into his coat pocket. He no longer needed it to detect whether a demon was present. "You're a long way from where we met, demon," Swaine said. "Have you missed your friends?"
Long way. Short way. There's no difference, sorcerer.
The figure descended with uneven steps. Swaine cast a spell of illumination, the pale glow pushing out from his hands and arms to reveal a man dressed in filthy garb. Tufts of beard traced his pale cheeks and rode his upper lip. His wide head showed thinning hair beneath a woolen cap. Half the teeth in his mouth were gone, and his nose looked to have been on the receiving end of one too many blows. Thick arms perhaps compensated for his crooked leg dragging behind him, barely able to keep him upright. The foot angled to a shocking degree inside a shoe barely 3/4 the size of his other shoe.
Distance is nothing,
the man with the crooked leg said.
Time is nothing.
Is that why it took you so long to find me then? Swaine didn't move, watching the man carefully as he reached the bottom of the stairs into the crypts. He searched for signs. Was the man possessed, under the thrall of a demon? Or was this a corpse in which the demon had taken up residence? Either scenario called for a different strategy if he was going to leave the church with his sanity and his soul intact, or leave it at all.
I've watched you the whole time,
the man with the crooked leg said. Of course you have, so powerful. Demons despised condescension, riven as they were with an endless appetite for self-aggrandizement. Such unquenchable flames, yet it was often their downfall, a poisonous pride capable of engulfing them. The man with the crooked leg reached the bottom of the stairs and gave Swaine a ghastly smile. Swaine watched the eyes, the gaze, the movement of the pupils, scrutinizing the demeanor for the subtle signs of possession. He found none. Corpse, then, Swaine thought. It wasn't unheard of for a demon to occupy a dead body. Theory held that such a vehicle offered a more stable passage through the world than in the native state, where the currents of the planes as well as the risks of other, more powerful demons striking out posed unpredictable threats. Or perhaps they enjoyed the mechanics of the flesh. No one really knew. Still, it gave Swaine clearer choices.
You and I have business, sorcerer.
I've no business with the likes of you.
Let me change your mind.
How tedious, Swaine said.
You're the one.
The man with the crooked leg rolled his hands, palms out, as though presenting Swaine to a crowd of admirers. Looking to tickle my fancy, Swaine said. I expect something subtler than that from someone for whom time and distance mean nothing. Hints of prophecy, a secret just for me. Try again. As he spoke, he worked his hand into the pocket in his breeches. Deflection and redirection were key. Taking the bait was precisely what a demon wanted. More important was the proper state of mind in conversing with the infernal. Observing the state of his own mind from a remove was key, keeping distance between his reactions and his responses, always. Otherwise, it was too easy to get swept up in the words of the demon. Exactly why he spent at least an hour each day engaged in a form of intense inner concentration on his awareness.
I have something for you,
the demon spoke through the corpse. No, I don't think you do.
A key. The key.
How portentous.
You'll appreciate it much more than anyone else.
Appreciate this, Swaine said. He yanked a disc of hammered silver from his pocket, hung from a length of thin steel chain. Hexed 33 times, warded 7 times, and glamoured with 3 layers of invocations of banishment, the medallion glimmered. The demon howled, throwing back the head of the corpse as it slammed into the stones of the wall. Swaine shouted the accompanying ward. The corpse lifted into the air, limbs thrashing as the potent magic surrounded it, sinking into the flesh, reaching the essence of the demon within. Swaine was hardly about to wander unprotected into a trap of any kind, and had brought the medallion for just such a purpose. Very few demons could withstand the power. Holding the medallion aloft, he approached the vibrating corpse. "Your name, demon?" The cords on the corpse's neck stood out in relief. Veins bulged along the forehead and the hands, curled as they were into hooks. A choking sound tore from the corpse's throat. Much as it struggled, it couldn't match Swaine's banishment magic. "Fine," Swaine said, feeling the power swirl around the medallion. The demon growled and thrashed, but was pinned against the granite slabs of the wall. "Begone, trouble me no further, back to the abyss with you." He spoke the words of power he'd woven within the medallion. The corpse trembled, soon vibrating with such ferocity as to blear and grow hazy. Swaine shouted the final phrase, and the air within the crypt expanded with intense pressure before sucking away with a bone-jarring whoosh that left him staggering. Within a moment, the air righted itself, the planes righted themselves, and the corpse of the man with the crooked leg crumbled to the floor. A thin exhalation leaked out of his distended lungs, and then he fell silent, still. As Swaine reached for his gauge again, he paused. Voices drifted down from the church above, and footsteps banged about the large space. "What in the hell was that?" a voice called out. "Every inch, lads, look about," another voice answered. "Damn it," Swaine muttered. Someone had followed the man with the crooked leg, or seen flashes of light, or who knew what. In any event, he wasn't going to wait around to find out. Sweeping the materials into his satchel, he rushed up the stairs, taking them 2 and 3 at a time. No time to put the lid back on the coffin, no time to drag the corpse of the man with the crooked leg off into the darkness. The strange tableau would have to stand. At the top of the stairs, he hurried to the auxiliary altar, peering out around the corner. A dozen soldiers spread out, come in through the main door, muskets at the ready, 2 of them leading the way with lanterns. Drained as he was, Swaine grit his teeth and whispered, "Beneath Raven's wing," a spell of cloaking. His head felt ready to split in 2 from the effort, but the enchantment wrapped him in shadow, chilling him to the bone in the process. He slid into the nave and traced the wall back toward the door. None of the soldiers would see even a hint of him, as long as he didn't crash into any of them on his way out. He moved quietly as he could, glad for the way the sounds of their boots bounced from wall to vault to window, covering the sound of his own steps. At the door, he darted past the one soldier left to stand watch, slipping out into the thick fog that lay across Newgate Street. As the damp darkness swallowed him, he glanced back. The hulking shape of Christ Church faded, tall steeple draped in night, soon blending with the curtains of fog and drizzle that closed in after him. Chapter 11. Unseen, unheard, unspoken. Swaine's demons muttered, restless. Tucked away in the back of his mind, their unease lingered like an itch on the inside of his skull, while the bindings to their will grew taut, violin strings wound to the point of snapping. It might be simply a reaction to the precautions he'd undertook since the encounter with the demon by Catherine Nunn's coffin. Nothing about the incident sat well with Swaine, thus the additional glamours laid out in his rooms, passive wards cast on entrance and egress, nightly passes around his quarters with the calibrated enharmonic gauge, protective spells when he left his rooms, as the ones he'd cast this evening, his collar up against the cold breath of coming winter sweeping in from the water. Perhaps such vigilance in itself raised the hackles of his demons, he thought, ignoring their faint tugs at his awareness. Better than the alternative theories he'd entertained, that they knew their master had been marked by a powerful fiend and were waiting for the inevitable ambush to make a perilous moment even more dire by attempting to turn on him, a reaction to the subtle presence of a new fiend hiding in the shadows nearby, seeking some sly avenue into Swaine's mind, ready to poison his thoughts and drag him down the lengthy and terrible road to demonic possession. Swaine shook his head, frowning. No, he was more careful than that. He'd scanned himself and his surroundings a dozen times, always coming up with nothing. He'd been as thorough as it was possible to be, for precision was the most urgent demand of sorcery. One miscalculation was all it might take to spend every moment in an agony worse than flame, brand, flay, or lash could hope to inflict. Forever, or at least until the will and soul of the possessed wore away to dust, a stone carving disintegrating over eons in the desert winds. No, caution and prudence received nothing less than Swaine's full attention since leaving the side of Nunn's coffin. Any more would require a better sorcerer, and he knew he was the best there was, modesty aside. Such care, of course, required extra time. Thus, Swaine arrived at the Mitre Tavern a full hour prior to the hour arranged for his meeting with Thomas Summerfield. As discreetly as he could, blending in with the foot traffic that passed along that stretch of Fleet Street, he surveilled the location. Using a combination of subtle magic and sorcery, he determined to a reasonable certainty that the establishment and the alleys and courtyards adjacent to it were free of the infernal. Likewise, he detected no countermagic, no spells set for triggering, no hex, enchantment, or cantrip wound about the place. The grandson of Alfred Summerfield merited no less than a thorough investigation of the premises. Just as comforting, he saw no signs of constable or king's soldier, other than a pair of scarlet-clad horsemen who cantered by the mitre without giving it a glance. At the appointed hour, Swaine slipped in through the green-painted doorway, his cheeks and fingers burnished red from the cold. Heat from the wide hearth and the many lanterns, not to mention the throng of tradesmen and shopmen laughing as they drained their pewter mugs, already flushed and filling the air with breathy ale fumes, wrapped him quickly and thankfully. A pall of smoke from the hearth and a dozen tobacco pipes gave the public room its own fog. Swaine found a narrow bench in the back corner and ordered a warm cider, watching the door for the man who would match Devon Woods's description of Summerfield. But 2 minutes passed before a plump fellow of clear means, as evinced in the knee-length dark velvet coat, waistcoat trimmed with golden brocade, ruffled silken cuffs, well-tailored breeches and wig clubbed at the back with a plum-coloured ribbon, pushed through the door and glanced about, cutting through the crowd with his silver-tipped walking stick held before him like the prow of a ship. He looked to be no older than his early 20s. With a nod and a lift of his hand, Swaine signalled Summerfield his way. Summerfield stopped before Swaine, breathing notably from the exertion. He inclined his head. "Thomas Summerfield, at your service, Mr. Swaine." "And I at yours, Mr. Summerfield." Summerfield slid onto the bench across from Swaine. "Thomas, please." He raised his cane to the barkeep. "Brandy, your best." The barkeep nodded and brought over a squat bottle and 2 delicate glasses. Summerfield slipped him coins. "And anything hearty you've got plated up, if you would." He turned to Swaine. "Have you eaten, Mr. Swaine?" "August, and no." "2 plates, then," he said to the barkeep. "Extra for you if you don't dawdle, much thanks." The barkeep scooped up the coin and smiled. Summerfield looked back at Swaine and smiled. "I'm famished and impatient." He tippled brandy into each glass and slid Swaine's over to him. Without taking a sip, he sat back and slapped his hands on his considerable thighs. "We meet at last." "If only I'd known you were looking to make my acquaintance," Swaine said. "If I'd known sooner that a man of your talents called London home, I'd have sought you out years ago." Summerfield sipped his brandy, pursing his lips as he evaluated it. He smacked his lips and nodded, apparently satisfied. "The paucity of interest in the unseen arts lulled me into thinking I was the only man in England who cared." "There are some who care very much. Lionel Sackville, for instance." "A fool." Summerfield shook his head in dismissal, sending the wattle of flesh beneath his chin swaying like a half-full water-skin. "And quite insane. Do you know how I know?" Swaine raised an eyebrow. "He attempted to court my sister," Summerfield continued. "Only the insane would show a carnal interest in my sister, the hideous cow. Ergo, the man is mad." Swaine held the surprise off his face at hearing such an opinion hurled out so casually by a man only just met.
Sackville and his ilk are the very face of the problem this great empire embraces with such dull supplication and dutiful somnambulance."
Summerfield finished. He drained his glass of brandy and refilled it while staring out across the public room, spilling a decent slosh of the amber liquid onto the table.
"A toad."
"Yet he has the ear of His Majesty, does he not?"
"God help us all."
Summerfield waved his fleshy hand as though clearing away a fly before his face.
"And one wonders why the glories of yesteryear grow ever more lustrous in the telling. How could they not, when such drab minds as those who steer the empire wish the present and future to be as uninspiring as their own inner lives?"
He looked up from his brandy.
"But fear not, Mr. Swaine. I didn't call on you to subject you exclusively to my cheerful opinions, for where there is a spark there is hope for a brighter future, and I believe you are that spark, sir."
"The weight of the future rests on me, does it? How worrisome."
"Conflagration of the future. Let's not mix our metaphors. Conflagration, ready to illuminate the potential of the unseen world."
Swaine watched Summerfield down his third brandy. His remained between his hands, untouched. "I stand corrected. How fiery." Summerfield leaned forward.
"Oh, don't be coy, and better still, don't be humble. I've large ears in addition to my large belly, and they know where to listen. You've been dedicated, that much is clear."
Devon, Swaine thought.
"And you've been impeccable in your purchases," Summerfield continued. "Before I caught wind of you, I was furious with you, if you must know. The mysterious habitué of select book-dealers, the insufferable purchaser of all the new arrivals, preying on the 100 miles from here to Bath that held me back in spite of my handsome, but apparently insufficient, commissions to said book-dealers."
"London doesn't appeal, sir," Swaine said.
"London does, sir, but London doesn't encompass my family estate, Drumbridge Hall, and the only thing better than fine cosmopolitan living is subsidized living in the lap of luxury. Even the mice of Drumbridge have their own footmen. Foot-mice, I suppose."
He smiled, the flush of his cheeks providing clear testimony to the ample brandy Swaine guessed abundant in the cellars of Drumbridge alongside Summerfield's splendid mice and their servants. "I imagine your grandfather amassed one of the great libraries of such books," Swaine said.
"Indeed he did. Yet might I enjoy the fabled Summerfield Library? Far from it. Cobblers' children unshod and all that. The dear man left half a dozen scraps of ill-considered and contradictory wishes in place of a proper will. Between that and the vultures who afflicted that damnable society of his, 6 out of 7 of his books found their way off the premises before the first snow fell after his disappearance. Most of the rest were stolen by a treacherous wag who claimed to be my grandfather's solicitor. Positively useless now, by the way. Can't remember a thing about where the books have gone off to. The poor man gathers plaster for breakfast, wanders the grounds half-dressed in his barrister's robes, half-dressed in his dear wife's knickers, and talking to the boles of trees. Mostly arguments, I may attest."
"Oh dear, don't tell me I've been unwittingly buying up your family inheritance."
"You may have."
Summerfield smiled as the barkeep set down 2 pewter plates, stacked generously with a pottage that allured with hints of rosemary and sausage, slices of duck, and biscuits draped in seasoned gravy. A slab of fresh butter and a bowl of cream and berries completed the serving.
Summerfield rubbed his palms together. "And an ale, my good man."
The barkeep looked at Swaine, who shook his head. Summerfield shook out a napkin and tucked it into his collar, digging into the fowl with knife and finger.
"And if you have gathered up such tomes as flew off from Drumbridge in a heartbreaking flock so many decades ago, well done. Better in your hands than mine, all told."
"You don't practice?"
"Practice? I acquire. I savour. I amass. No, I don't practice, far too lazy for that, and as you might imagine it's rather frowned upon in the Summerfield line."
"I'd have thought the opposite."
Would you? After losing any chance of our long-sought peerage, shunned by both the local villagers, that frost is just beginning to thaw 65 years after the fact, and those men of influence who might clear the way for successful careers, and a legal blot that still follows the name, well, one might forgive my family for not seeing the appeal in the many splendours of the unseen arts. Summerfield ate with gusto. The more unseen, the better. Unseen, unheard, unspoken, forever and ever, amen. Might as well change the family motto to that. Fancy it up by putting it into Latin. Corvus repente in audita indicta est semper et in secula seculorum, amen, Swaine said. Summerfield pointed his knife at him. And that is why such books belong underneath your nose and not mine. I can't be bothered. Yet you wish for a great conflagration of magic to light England's way into the future. Well, I didn't say that I was the one to raise the flames. A vicarious conflagration. To some extent, though I'm not entirely useless. I have carefully nurtured relationships, arrangements where family name might fail. Family wealth evokes a much more thoughtful response. More than enough of that to bend the bow. All I need now is the proper arrow. He looked at Swaine with the same look he'd given his meal on first sight. We've gone from fires to archery, Swaine said, still well within the language of military assault, I see. To what or whom are we laying siege? Not that Swaine in any way felt a we in the offing. He only wanted to know what Summerfield was getting at. Whatever hopes he'd harboured of an evening of intriguing discussions of magic appeared to have been glamoured away by the rubbing together of Summerfield's hands at the serving of the meal. He knew nothing noteworthy of the unseen arts. The man wanted something of him. To ignorance, sir, Summerfield said, to the closing of the English mind. I fear you shall require more than a lone arrow for such a victory. True, but all wars begin with the first shot, do they not? That is all I seek. Is it? Well, from you. For now. Swaine moved to stand. I'm afraid I've wasted your time already, sir. You seek something I'm not now, nor have any desire to be. Summerfield raised his hands away from his meal. You haven't heard me out. I think it's fair to say I've heard enough, sir. While the closing of the English mind, as you say, is lamentable, I've charged those walls enough times to have lost the will for yet another repulse. If enough people are committed to defend such ignorance to the bloody end, they may have at it. I've no interest in hearing, yet again, their illogical arguments, their wounded protests, their smug diatribes. To witness the low boil of their eternal anger and resentment roil up into incoherent rage when challenged, to hear their sad displays of indignant outrage, ever at the ready, fill the public square as though volume and scorn were the measure of morality, to confront again and again their flimsy assertions in the wisdom of the common Englishman, and how affronted that is in the face of even hard evidence to the contrary. No, if they wish to drop anchor 150 years in the past, they may do so. I've better ways to fill the precious few hours I'm granted in this world. Mr. Swaine. Swaine smiled and slid out off the bench. Best of luck, Mr. Summerfield. Would £500 help you more satisfyingly fill your precious hours, sir? I beg your pardon. £500 sterling. That's a fortune. Summerfield nodded his head. He motioned to the bench across from him. Swaine frowned, but took his seat again. I told you, Mr. Swaine, I acquire. I'm not for sale. I'm not interested in owning you. I only want some of your time. £500 worth. A small commitment of your time, of the right sort, is worth more to me than you might think. Moreover, you just removed the last of my doubts as to whether you fit the bill. You very much do. I don't understand, Swaine said. Ah, but you just proved exactly the opposite. You understand completely. You understand the enemy we face. You understand their tricks, their strategies, their weaknesses, all of it. Swaine leaned forward, his palms on the table. He lowered his voice. If you want me to perform something of a magical nature, I'm afraid I can't do it.
no matter how much money you have.
Why, I would never engage in such criminality, sir.
Summerfield's expression didn't change.
Nor would I discuss it in a public room, should I be so inclined, which, of course, I wouldn't be, for I'm a Christian, an Englishman, a Summerfield, in that order.
He drained his ale and winked at Swaine with a glassy eye.
Or so it has been hammered into my soft head since birth. Bollocks to all that. But no, I don't need your talents with the unseen. I need your talents with words, a stirring demonstration of which you just graced me with. That's what I'm after, Swaine. I think it's time to strike the spark. Let fly the arrow, and if it costs me £500, so be it.
He turned his attention back to his meal and attacked his pottage with vigour.
But if you're really not interested, Mr. Swaine, I won't be offended. I understand the pressures put upon a man like you, how the system grinds one down until one's dreams are whittled away at year after year until they better fit within the confines of their time. Isn't that the whole point of the system?
He motioned with his free hand.
But at least eat your fill. Why turn up a chance to put a little practical food in your practical belly and call it another fine practical day? Please.
The young man was cleverer than he looked, Swaine admitted. He gazed about the public room of the tavern, then back at Summerfield, who stared at him with one eyebrow cocked. Swaine inhaled and sat back down. "Go on, Mr. Summerfield, I'm listening." The smile that cracked Summerfield's face was as wide as dreams. Chapter 12. Leave Sorcery to the Sorcerer. Snow squalls whirled from the night sky, piling on cornice, on roof's edge, on street lantern, on the windward side of chimney, ledge and step. Passing carriages spun the light snow up in their wakes, and drivers squinted against the storm. Swaine swiped small drifts from his hat and shoulders as he waited on newly muffled Blackfriars Lane across from Apothecary's Hall. As far as demons went, the hall and neighbouring buildings were clear. He'd arrived early to make certain. Now he watched as the members of the audience, scholars, students, men from court, lords and other members of Parliament, sundry others lured in out of curiosity or the desire to witness a rapier match of reputations, hurried in out of the whirling snow. He warmed his hands beneath the armpits of his coat and reminded himself what £500 could do for his situation. He spotted Phineas Hozier sidling down the street, head forward, shoulders hunched, avian even in his ungainly steps. The man would have passed him straight by had Swaine not stopped him with an outstretched hand lowered like a highway pike. As it was, Hozier flailed out of his thoughts in a gust of powdery snow, almost slipping to the cobblestones. "Hozier, it's me," Swaine said. Hozier peered at him, nose thrust forward.
Oh, I see. Thought you were a footpad, sir."
"Hiding in plain sight?"
"I've heard stories in the library."
"Would that we all might confine our lives to the stacks, Hozier. But here we are. Thank you for meeting me." Hozier bobbed his head.
"After the comfort you provided me, I owe you, sir. I believe my heart was literally tearing itself apart without your understanding ears, you see."
The throng of people across the way, heading into the hall hosting the debate, grew. Swaine didn't have much more time before he'd be expected. "Yes, you're quite welcome."
"The funeral haunts me still, sir," Hozier continued. "Lowered into the ground just as the sun dipped beneath the clouds, the sky magnificent, a fitting tribute to her beauty, I believed. It wasn't right, so young, placed so in the earth, denied any more daylight, forever."
"A loss indeed," Swaine interrupted, "one that will, in time, grow less raw, if no less tragic. But listen, I very much require your assistance."
"Assistance?"
The word came out strange, as though Hozier couldn't quite make out how that particular collection of syllables touched upon Catherine Nunn's last moments above ground. Yes, assistance. It should only require an hour or two of your time, but it is most important to me that it happens tonight.
Tonight?
Within the next 2 hours, to be clear. Swaine watched flurries cling to Hozier's eyelashes and crinkled brows.
The library is closed, sir. I'd need time to arrange to get the keys, as before, sir.
The assistance I require is of a more mundane nature, Hozier. He pointed to the hall across the way. I'm due to give a lecture in there, starting in the next 15 minutes. Hozier's eyes widened.
Apothecary's Hall? Do you mean to say that all those gentlemen are here to listen to you?
Some are here to listen to me, Swaine said. Likely more are here to listen to my debate opponent denounce my positions with all the self-righteous indignation of a man of middling intelligence who feels that God and the masses are firmly on his side. It shan't be pretty, I can fairly say.
Sorry, you don't mean Conyers Hargrove, sir?
Exactly, Conyers Hargrove. Word has gotten around, I take it. Hozier nodded.
All the talk this past fortnight, sir. The library is fair to bursting with all his acolytes, as is half the university. I never cared for him, to tell you the truth, mostly because he never cared for me. I don't know what it is, but a certain type of person renders me equal parts clumsy and idiotic, seemingly. Words come out wrong. Ridiculous expressions take over my face. Mind fogs up and leaves me scrambling around like a frightened mouse looking for any hole to hide in.
Oh, he does it on purpose, I can assure you, Swaine said.
I've never understood why.
Because he can. Because he believes it earns him something that passes for respect or applause or admiration. Because he's learned that, much like a muscle-bound brute and his fists, establishing dominance over others comes rather easily for him. It feeds his self-regard, and he lacks the temperance to respect the unspoken boundaries of civility the rest of us adhere to if doing so gains him even the smallest advantage. Hozier nodded his head slowly as Swaine spoke, then snapped his gaze back to Swaine.
You're the sorcerer?
Did you think I was a costume designer with an overzealous imagination? Really, Hozier?
No, it's not. It's just that I pictured a more sinister figure, that's all.
I'll take that as the compliment you're desperately trying to find your way to in lieu of noting my ordinary appearance and bearing.
Not at all, sir. I meant to say...
Swaine waved off his explanations. Irrelevant. Let's not dwell. In any event, I don't believe that Hargrove is going to find me nearly as forgiving a target as he's used to facing. I'm no frightened mouse, to use your own phrase, nor am I quite as impressed with him as the rest of London is. That, however, is my task for this evening. For you, Hozier, I have a different task, one with every bit as much import as my own. It must not fail. Can I count on you, sir? Hozier blinked the snowflakes from his eyes, glancing from Swaine to the hall across the street and back to Swaine.
Does it involve sorcery, sir?
No, it does not. We'll leave the sorcery to the sorcerer. Here is what I require. With a glance at his pocket watch, Swaine explained. The snow grew heavier, whipped on the winds that murmured around street lamp roof and doorway, lit golden by the light spilling from the windows of Apothecary's Hall. Chapter 13. English Magic. Swaine saw it even before Conyers Hargrove spoke. The crowd wasn't and would never be his, not in the slightest. The dark-panelled great hall filled with a diffuse murmur. A few men stared at Swaine where he sat on the elevated stage at one end of the hall, decorative columns and ornamental carved stallions rearing up behind him. Others chatted amongst themselves, many feigning to not even see him at all, as though nothing but an empty chair sat opposite the lectern from where Hargrove prepared to make his opening remarks. The only smile to be found was the inebriated one swimming across the fleshy, perspiring face of Thomas Summerfield, seated in the front row. When he'd greeted Swaine, reeking of stale tobacco smoke and gin, Pumping Swaine's hand in a clammy grip, he'd assured Swaine that any number of the men in attendance would be cheering him on at least half the hall. He was a fool. Wealthy, yes, but a fool just the same, and apparently at such a concentration as to contaminate anyone misfortunate enough to pass within his orbit. Fine, so be it. If Swaine had to endure an hour or more of scorn before a crowd of smug boulderheads, so certain of the gears and workings of the universe seen and unseen, incapable of erring, well, it was nothing he hadn't borne before, and with the second half of his £500 fee somewhere within reach of his drunken benefactor, he would do it with a smile. As the dry-looking gentleman, the master of the evening's ceremonies, the man who'd declined to even shake Swaine's hand, finished up his wheezing introduction of Hargrove and passed in front of Swaine with nary a glance, the audience sorted out its remaining sniffles, throat-clearing, shifting creaks and shoe-scuffling while Hargrove approached the lectern. A wide face with bovine eyes peering over a half-height fence of spectacles on his nose, Hargrove wore a tasteful wig, powdered and elegant. Instead of his college robes, he'd dressed in grey stockings, black breeches, and a heath-green waistcoat. He had no notes. He rested his hands on the polished mahogany and gazed at the audience, a beneficent smile tugging at the corners of his mouth.
"Gentlemen," he began, "a great claim hangs before us this wintry evening. So great a claim, in fact, that the only proper response from myself, my honourable opponent, or any one of us in this esteemed gathering must be humility. For as we slough off the chill, as we reaffirm our storied commitment to intellectual rigour, as we remind ourselves that we are but the newest link in an unbroken chain of English progress, we stand, as our forebears, at the edge of knowledge, peering into the great darkness and its tapestry of glittering stars, asking the most meaningful questions granted to those privileged by the Lord to draw breath and wonder. How much is there to discover? Upon what firmament does the edifice of English civilization rest? All of mankind, for that matter." Nods of approval. Swaine kept his face neutral. Hargrove scanned the crowd, not particularly demonstrating the humility promised. He continued, "Such questions of import. Yet would we not be remiss in asking ourselves if these questions haven't already been sufficiently asked and answered? Have we not already crawled out from the brambles of superstition, of confidence scandals, of ignorance, of charlatans?" He raised his hands with a jovial chuckle. Now, I'm neither tipping my hand nor slinging arrows from the starting gate. Settle down. These are worthy questions, worthy of my esteemed opponent, a man of uncommon intellect, nay, a man of genius, without question." Most eyes in the hall turned to Swaine. He kept his hands folded in his lap, watching Hargrove. Hargrove smiled. "For no other word befits the deft approach to the claim that English magic is due for a sober reassessment than that which you shall hear tonight from the man with whom I share the stage. Genius." He let the word hang for several beats, then turned and nodded to Swaine. Swaine inclined his head in return ever so slightly. "How else might we describe the tactic of rendering up into down, of rendering black into white, right before our very eyes?" Hargrove said. "Should I ask my opponent to defend his wish to draw us back into the shadows of ignorance, why, he shall simply look at me and declare that he is not. In fact, he shall insist that we are the ones desperate for the darkness of ignorance, we are the enemies of progress. As I said, genius. For what can one do but lower one's jaw, stunned, when confronted by such a brash reversal of fact? He shall then press his case. The brambles of superstition, the confidence scandals, the ignorance of charlatans lie not with the unsteady minds spouting off about spells and sorcery, but rather with Christian men of science, men of letters, men of faith, law, and honour. We are the ones clinging to the medieval. We are the ones afraid to unleash the unlimited potential for progress, for reason, for truth. It is only then that we might apprehend the breathtaking nature of my opponent's arguments, even as we admire the genius with which he makes them. Do note if I'm wrong, gentlemen." With that, Hargrove lifted his hands from the lectern and returned to his seat.
Muffled applause of gloved hands and a smattering of "Hear, hear" accompanied him. Swaine inhaled, then stood. Neither his hands nor his voice shook in the slightest. A hall full of dilettantes was nothing compared to the danger he'd faced every time he'd summoned a demon. He bore the scorn of so-called experts as a Londoner did fog and chill, as a natural feature of the landscape. He stepped to the lectern and coolly gazed across the assembly. "What a lovely introduction, Conyers," he said, eliciting a low wave of laughter. "I shall endeavour to not disappoint. And whilst I might return the favour and underscore the clever rhetorical move we all witnessed you make just now, I think it shall be altogether more fruitful to leave behind such a focus on stratagem and turn our attention to the heart of the matter at hand. As you say, we do stand, as ever, at the precipice of achievement. Behind us, history. Ahead of us, unseen, vast and unplumbed, the future. While we might argue endlessly about history, who behaved in good faith or bad, who forges, as you say, new links versus who merely looks to earlier links for their own validation, the future beckons, insistent, relentless. Well, at least he had their attention, he noted. Hargrove's gambit had been designed to sweep the legs of his argument out from underneath him before he even started. Clever, but predictable. As those in the audience who'd come expecting him to sputter and flail as he was lured into one oratorical trap after another realized he wasn't the luring type, they seemingly noticed him for the first time. In fact, I might suggest our obsession with history does little more than keep the future at arm's length in perpetuity. It keeps us in our blinkers, in our tack, hauling forward every tired, dusty, dreary argument ever had. Can we declare ourselves the winners? Can we declare our opponents the losers? Let's recite it all again and again ad infinitum. Fight the same fights, thunder the same charges, crown ourselves with glories won by others, and gaze into the mirror, congratulating ourselves. Swaine paused. The crowd watched him. "Pointless. I won't do it. I haven't an interest in a scintilla of it. I only care for one thing. How might we lift England to loftier heights than ever before, defining the future as we wish to see it, ourselves, here, now?" Opening statements made, Swaine relinquished the lectern to an enthusiastic wave of applause, none more thunderous than that which erupted from the glassy-eyed and flushed figure of Thomas Summerfield, standing unsteadily from his chair in the front row. Chapter 14. Asps and Adders. Phineas Hozier paused, the light of a single candle wavering on a draught. Had he heard a door open below? Straining, he listened some more. Shook his head. "Make myself crazy," he whispered. "Sorcerer's rooms, that's all. Perfectly safe, Mr. Swaine assured me." To reassure himself, he lifted his right hand. The tarnished ring of silver astride his index finger reflected the flame of the candle. "Don't take this off, no matter what you do. It will protect you," Swaine had told him. Of course, as Phineas gazed around the shadowed rooms, the thought of what he needed protection from leaped to the front of his mind in a way it rather hadn't as he'd stood on the street, listening to Swaine explain what he required of him. "Sorcerer's rooms, sorcerer's books. What might be ill-advised about this?" he whispered. "Books, just books. I handle them all day long, ring or no ring. Just books." With another glance at the door behind him, he continued organizing Swaine's books into the two trunks, maximizing the space allotted with an eye trained in the stacks. Every now and then he paused, curious as to the contents of a particular book. Burial Curses and Disinterment Magic by S.K. Hayes, for instance, or The Dreadful Account of Softfoot Peter on the North York Moors by Angeline Postgate. They weren't titles he'd ever seen in either of the libraries he'd worked in. He placed the latter in amongst a pair of slender volumes with a shiver. As he sat back, his shadow loomed up along the wall, nearly startling a yelp out of him. Testing that the lid of the trunk still closed, he looked over the remaining volumes. He ran a finger along the side of his nose.
"I've the will, but where's the way?"
Flipping the lid of the second trunk open again, he worked some magic of his own, allowing himself a smile at the thought, and found a combination of rearrangements that found a home for even those last stragglers.
Never trust a sorcerer to do a librarian's job, even when...
The door at the bottom of the stairs closed, the tight door frame squealing as it had when Phineas himself had shut it. He swung his head around to the door at the top of the stairs. "Fast as you can, and don't let anyone see you," Swaine had also said. With no additional rooms at the top of the stairs but the ones he stood in, Phineas swallowed, realizing that only someone bound for Swaine's rooms would have cause to use that stairwell. A runner creaked.
"Oh, dear,"
Phineas whispered. He stood, both his knees popping loudly. 2 trunks. 2 satchels. No need to worry about the rest, Swaine had assured him. Phineas grabbed the candle by the holder and brought it to the far room, where another narrow staircase led down to an alley off the street out front. Quickly he carried down the 2 satchels, leaving them at the lower landing by the door leading outside. He hurried back up and to the room with the trunks. As he glanced at the front door, all the hair on the back of his neck rippled. The temperature of the room seemed to have dropped by 20 degrees. His breath rolled out in clouds. He unconsciously put one hand to his stomach as it knotted. "Don't let anyone see you." In that instant, Phineas decided that the very last thing on earth he wanted was to be seen by whomever was climbing the main staircase to Swaine's rooms. Spinning around, he attempted to lift both trunks at once, one stacked upon the other. The cords on his neck stood out. His arms quaked. A sound reached his large ears. Something scraping along the wall on the stairs, sharp and hard, like fingernails. The sigh that escaped his lips was equal parts terror and dismay. Without hesitating, he grabbed the top trunk on its own and staggered with it into the far room, grinding his knuckles against the door frame as he passed through it. Not slowing, he carried the trunk sideways down the stairs, nearly tripping over his feet and tumbling shoulders first to the bottom. Just catching himself, he lowered the trunk as soundlessly as he could manage. Returning to the top with as little noise as possible, he paused. He could just make out a sliver of the front room from his vantage. The door was still closed. Whatever sounds he'd heard earlier had ceased, yet the silence replacing it frightened him even more. He chewed his lip, still not moving. Who would come up the stairs and stand there without knocking, without saying a word? He gazed at the edge of the final trunk. All he had to do was cross through a pair of rooms and fetch it. If the floor had been writhing with asps and adders, he'd have been more eager to return to the front room. He rubbed the ring around his finger, turning it, sliding it. "Don't take this off, no matter what you do. It will protect you." He pulled his other hand away, aware that he'd nearly slipped it from his finger without thinking. Why on earth had he been about to do that?
"Right," he muttered. "No more dawdling. They're books, Phineas. Your charge. Books. That's all."
One careful step at a time, growing light-headed with each one, he crossed to the threshold of the main room. Shadows blotted out the corners, a faint glow of street lanterns touching the snow-lined window beyond the door. He paused. So silent. Had it truly been that silent as he'd packed away the last of Mr. Swaine's books? Nothing about the silence felt right. He wondered if he'd made himself hear the noises from earlier. Lord knew his imagination required little prodding to take flight, and if it were colder now, well, the wintry winds of London were ruthless footpads, making their way past window and lock as though they weren't even there. Shaking his head and scolding himself for overreacting, Phineas stepped forward, ready to pick up the trunk.
"Phineas."
Phineas clamped a hand over his mouth, eyes wide. His heart nearly trampled out through his ribs.
"Open the door."
The voice sounded as cold as a pair of roof slates grinding against one another.
"Please."
Phineas nearly wet himself. He knew the voice as terrible and without warmth as it sounded. Instead of pulling his hand away from his mouth, he kept it there, pressing down even harder, for he suddenly had more than half a mind to answer,
"Catherine, is that you?"
But it wasn't. It couldn't be. He'd been to the burial. He'd seen the coffin lowered into the earth, the last sight of it leaving the world, with each clump of soil tossed in after it.
"Even death couldn't keep me from you. Don't you see?"
Hands trembling of their own accord, Phineas reached for the trunk's handles, doing all he could to convince himself he was in a dream, or at least letting his imagination get away from him. The silence after the words, her words, bore all the weight of the grave. Still, blunt, dead.
"I'll give you all you ever wanted, Phineas,"
the voice croaked.
"all of me. You'll see what it's like, how sweet the darkness is."
The inside knob on the door remained still. He glanced at the ring on his finger again.
You can't come inside, can you?"
he said, his voice trembling.
"You can let me in, please. I don't want to lose you a second time."
Phineas still remembered the warmth of Catherine's hand in his own, the forest pool greens and browns of her hazel eyes, the slope of her shoulders, her braid of hair looped across the right one, the shape of her knees as she'd leaned them against him the night they'd talked until dawn.
"Just turn the knob, and you can forget everything else in my arms."
"Yes, well, perhaps we can talk," Phineas said, quietly as he could. He hefted the last trunk, straining but not grunting.
"As we did before. Anything, I beg you, my love."
Phineas squeezed his eyes shut at those final 2 words. Opening them, he stepped away from the front door, hurrying through the middle room. A tear bobbled on his eyelid and rolled down his cheek.
"Just a moment,"
he called over his shoulder. As he neared the back staircase, the candle flame wavered and extinguished. His skin rippled with chills. A sound came from the front room. Without looking back, Phineas bounded down the stairs. Still holding the trunk, he struggled with the latch, finally lifting it enough to bang the door open. Fat snowflakes whirled inside. The thin nag shivered in the hitches of the wagon he'd pulled to the front of the alley. Rushing, slipping on the snowy bricks underfoot, Phineas dropped the trunk outside the door. Tossing both satchels over his shoulders, he dragged out the second trunk. With one terrified glance up into the darkness of Swaine's rooms at the top of the stairs, he turned and grabbed both trunks by their end handles, sliding them through the snow like sleds, straining and struggling to keep his footing against the weight of the books. Upstairs in the front room, inky shadows seeped in around the hinges of the door. After a moment, the knob turned, and a pale hand pushed the door inward. Chapter 15. A Public Spectacle. Hargrove wasn't happy, not at all, Swaine noted with pleasure. Oh, he tried one tack after another, though none Swaine hadn't encountered time and again. The unseen arts lacked the precision, the rigour of science. Sham and tomfoolery prevailed. Such practices put the populace in danger. Such extraordinary claims demonstrated intemperate logic. True knowledge had only driven the unseen arts deeper into the shadows for a reason. Yet for each assertion Hargrove lobbed, Swaine countered with the same unperturbable calm with which he'd opened his remarks, not giving an inch, flicking away Hargrove's straw men with little more than a slightly raised eyebrow, drawing a gentle focus to the flaws underpinning the man's assertions, using Hargrove's own arguments against his own position over and over. Swaine didn't, however, deceive himself into thinking he'd won much of the audience to his side. They watched, rapt, yes. For all that, he suspected most simply enjoyed the sight of Hargrove hoisted by his own petard, the satisfaction in seeing the arrogant brought low being one of life's more gratifying pleasures. Others no doubt appreciated the fight Swaine brought to the evening, though in the end they fully expected the lion to devour the Christian no matter how well the Christian fought, for where logic and rhetoric failed, Hargrove's position, influence and connections would eventually prevail. As he watched Hargrove grasp the edges of the lectern with whitening knuckles, he knew what was coming now that all his other strikes had been turned. "And it would appear that my opponent, smug, condescending, believing himself smarter than the rest of us, would also like us to forget about sin." Yes, there it was, Swaine saw. Sin, religion, a final retreat into the unassailable realm where reason finds no purchase and phantoms hold sway, immune to even the most direct hit. "For in his silver-tongued remarks," Hargrove continued, "one needn't search far to detect his scorn for the beating heart of faith that has always sustained England, guided mankind from the depravities of the past, kept us in the Lord's good stead. He won't tell you so, mind you. He hides it all away, asks us all to forget what we all know, insists the way forward is in fact the way back, further from God's will, deeper into sin. Well, we shall not be fooled." Another round of applause swept the hall, along with the deeper vocalizations of men whose faith had been, allegedly, questioned. No wonder religion would never relinquish its grip on mankind. There was no easier way to stir an otherwise moral man into behaving irrationally, and in doing so, serve the powerful and the impotent in equal measure, Swaine knew. Still, he stood and stepped again to the lectern. When the noise died down, he met every gaze without blinking. "Whether or not my opponent believes the unseen arts to be sin is irrelevant," he said. "He may harbour whatever beliefs he fancies, yet we are here to discuss laws and facts, for those, in the end, are what lie at the heart of English civilization. Created by men, defended by men, evolved by men as enlightened insight pulls us further from ignorance. Laws, not superstition." He watched as Thomas Summerfield slid a flask from his pocket and tippled a mouthful. As long as he has the money, this is all worth it, Swaine thought. As for the rest of the audience, their hackles were up. There would be no getting through to most of them, exactly as Hargrove intended, having failed to hold his ground anywhere else on the field. A bustle off to the side of the hall caught Swaine's eye. Several uniformed soldiers moved in a group along the far wall. At the centre, a dark-haired gentleman with a trimmed beard on his chin. Swaine recognised him instantly. Lionel Sackville, a man tragically born a century too late to become His Majesty's Witchfinder General, yet determined to fill the role nonetheless. Swaine looked at Summerfield, who merely smiled at him with flushed cheeks and fop sweat beading up on his forehead. "That's quite enough," Sackville called out. "His Majesty will not suffer such an assault on Christianity by the likes of you." Murmurs swept the hall. Heads turned. Swaine glanced behind him. The calm delight on Hargrove's face told Swaine all he needed to know. The entire evening had been a set-up, a farce, a public spectacle for the climax of which was to be his public arrest for blasphemy or some other such ridiculous charge. "Do go on, August," Hargrove purred. Soldiers swept in from the other side of the hall, bursting in from a side door on cue. Summerfield swept his head back and forth, his eyes bulging as the soldiers rushed him as well. Within moments they had him by the arms, dragging him from his seat. A dozen muskets pointed at Swaine as Sackville levelled a finger at him. "In His Majesty's name you are hereby placed under arrest," Sackville said. "You may consider your words from the tower, Mr. Swaine." Swaine hesitated for perhaps a full second before deciding he was done with being cautious. With a whispered incantation, he flung his hands in the direction of Summerfield. An eruption of ravens filled the air before him, wing, feather, beak and eye of smoky obsidian whirling and squawking. The crowd pushed back with a gasp, knocking over chairs and benches. Soldiers batted away at the birds, only to see them shear apart into thick smoke. In the same instant, Swaine called for his handiest demon to clear a path for him as he leaped from the stage and into the crowd. Soldiers flew into the air as the fiend led the way. Swaine grabbed at Summerfield, taking him by the arm and dragging him along the front of the stage. Shouts and cries filled the hall as the shadow ravens swooped to the arched ceiling and down, diving at the gathering, leaving trails of sooty lines behind them. "This way," Swaine said to the frightened, lumbering Summerfield. With another incantation, a great wind rose in Swaine's wake, powerful enough to snuff out the candles on the chandeliers, to send scarf and hat flying amongst the scores of shadow ravens. One soldier after another was tossed aside as Swaine made his way through a door in the side of the hall, pulling down the protesting Summerfield with him. Down a narrow hallway they burst into a kitchen, preparing the finishing touches on the banquet planned for after the debate. Cooks cried out as a path of destruction preceded the two fugitives, pots, tankards and platters knocked asunder by the demon. Glass shattered, wood cracked, even the stone of the flooring shuddered. Seeing a door to the outside, Swaine slammed it open, sliding on the snowy ground. Cold air shocked after the warmth of the hall and the kitchen behind. Summerfield gaped. "Bloody brilliant, with those shadow ravens." Swaine didn't slow. "We're leaving. Where's your carriage? Tell me you took a carriage." Shouts from around the front of the hall broke out. Several soldiers on horseback turned in their direction. "Of course I did, and I have to slow down. Can't breathe. This is brilliant, by the way. If my heart doesn't give in, of course," Summerfield panted. He tried to stop, but Swaine didn't relent. The man was heavy as an ox, but at least he had momentum. "Where?" Summerfield ground to a halt, swaying and looking around, bleary-eyed. He lifted a ham-like arm and pointed. "There it is." A two-horse carriage, a luxurious affair, no doubt well suited to the standards of Drumbridge Hall, stood on the side of the street. Soldiers hurried from the kitchens behind them. "And your driver is where?" Swaine said. "Probably at the tavern. We're not due to leave for another hour." Swaine sprinted with Summerfield to the wagon as shouts erupted behind them. "Then drive." "What, me?" "Yes, you." "I'm drunk." "No excuse." "I'm a terrible driver." A musket fired. The shot sailed wide, banging off a wrought iron gate that bordered the lane. "Mr. Summerfield," Swaine said. "Believe me," Summerfield continued, "horses hate me. Bloody things never go where I want, and I've a touch of vertigo, which makes riding up so high impossible." Another shot lifted a tuft of fresh snow from the roof of the carriage. The man was perfectly ridiculous. "And you have the rest of my fee?" Swaine said, looking around for an alternative escape. "Of course, in the carriage, locked in a box in the flooring." Half a dozen soldiers came after them, plus more from around the front of the debate hall. Swaine turned back up to the carriage. "Then get inside. Now, up we go." He ripped open the carriage door and practically threw Summerfield inside, heaving at the man's impressive bulk with his shoulder. Swaine motioned to the driver's bench and bade his demon to take the reins. The binding connection between his mind and the demon's tightened. This wouldn't be easy. Swaine threw himself in after Summerfield, urging the demon onward without pause. Both horses screamed in terror, but the carriage lurched into motion, sending drifts of snow off in plumes as the horses broke into a gallop. More shouting and musket shots followed. Swaine steadied himself on Summerfield's prone back, peering through the carriage's back window. 3 riders on horseback followed. More were sure to join them. He kept his concentration on the demon, urging him on, keeping to the broader roads. As the carriage careened along the snowy streets, Swaine had his hands full. The demon cared little for a steady ride, speeding around corners, whipping past lampposts, sending such foot and horse traffic as there was scattering in the carriage's wake. Several times the carriage took to just 2 wheels, leaning precariously to one side or the other, leaving Summerfield bleating in terror. Even with all that, the horsemen closed the gap, hats low against the thick snow. 3 more riders added to the chase. Swaine instructed the demon to find a route to the river. "I'm going to be sick," Summerfield said, bracing himself against the bottom of the seats. "We'll never get away." "Where's the money?" Swaine said. "How can you think about the money?" The carriage jolted with a bang over some unseen obstacle. One of the velvet curtains shook loose from its mountings. "Shall I explain what this evening has done for my reputation?" Swaine said. "You made him look like a fool, sir, as I hoped." "For all the good it does us, if you hadn't noticed." "Fine, fine," Summerfield said. He crawled across the carriage floor as it jostled and tipped. Unlocking a secret compartment and withdrawing a sack of bills, he shoved it at Swaine. "May you find good use of it in jail." "Neither one of us is going to jail."
"We're going to outride soldiers? I don't see."
The carriage skidded sideways after colliding with another carriage. Summerfield screamed. The demon, however, kept the horses straight, hooves pounding the snowy road as he drove them onward. "Listen to me carefully," Swaine said. "We'll only have a few moments, and if you can't concentrate, it won't work."
"Work? How?"
Swaine was more than half tempted to leave Summerfield behind in the carriage, let him blubber his way straight into a cell in the Tower of London. But no, he'd kept his end of the bargain, fruitless as the entire endeavour had turned out to be. Swaine had walked into the arrangement with open eyes. It wouldn't be right to abandon the man, fool or no. "Your grandfather would have appreciated what we're about to do, Summerfield." With another look to see how quickly the horsemen were closing in on the racing carriage, Swaine explained his plan. The ruddy colour drained from Summerfield's face as he did. As the carriage neared the Thames, winter winds sent the snow billowing up from its passage like white flames. Chapter 16. Driverless. The horses reared, coming up short before the piers, the turn too sharp for them to make. As the carriage rocked on its springs, soldiers on horseback galloped up next to it, shouting orders for Swaine and Summerfield to come out. Soon more soldiers swarmed up through the narrow cobbled lane. A dozen muskets pointed at the curtained windows. "Get him out of there right now," a captain yelled from his mount, pointing at the carriage with his sword. Two of the soldiers yanked open the side door, throwing it wide enough for their comrades to edge in with musket end and bayonet. Another soldier opened the door on the other side, his pistol covering the interior. The driverless carriage stood empty. A furious search yielded no sign of either fugitive. The soldiers cursed, spreading out their hunt amongst the barrels, crates, and stacks of coiled rope that opened out from the lane. Nothing. The panting of the horses gradually subsided as the water lapped the piers. Snow fell softly, melting into the river even as it settled over London, blanketing all. Chapter 17. Hearts brimming with courage. Wind caught the sails as they dropped, one by one. The Dorset's masts leaned, timber and rigging creaking, sailors calling out to one another as the wharfs and docks of Billingsgate diminished in the mists of dawn. Water crested along the ship's prow as they passed scores of other ships moored in the Thames and along the quays, their flags and pennants snapping on the cold breeze. August Swaine watched from the side of the deck, seated on one trunk while the other one, both loaded down with his beloved books, lay by his feet, an obedient hound by his master's side. He scanned the snow-draped edges of London drifting by. The city fancied itself the peak of civilization, but Swaine saw it differently, as a monument to a peak already passed. Was it reaching for ever higher truths? Were the men of influence and wealth who ruled it searching for new horizons of creation, looking to make their mark anywhere near as courageously as those who'd come before? No, of course not. They wished no more than to take what they could from the existing edifice of achievement, to occupy stations of privilege carved out a century or more earlier, to wring all they could from the system for their own benefit and for the benefit of their heirs. They were appetite, they were impulse, they were passengers on the great engines of civilization, content to be pulled along in currents designed by others. "Not for me," Swaine said, his breath swept away, a tatter of curling mist dissipating on the cold air. Maybe the New World had always been the place for such a man as he. After all, hadn't that always been what he'd striven for? To push the boundaries of insight, to discover passageways and paths into the darkness, to set eyes upon the previously unseen. What was that if not precisely a longing for a new world? And if his theories were correct, the new world contained one place of such confounding power as to make such dreams take hold, waiting to be dragged into existence by his own hands, his own will. Fitting, then, that he should be bound for a place shrouded in precisely the kind of ignorance, fear, and pious certainty that his worst detractors had marshalled against him. Maybe they wouldn't have been surprised had they known. Still, Swaine knew in that moment, as clear as the sunrise glinting off of the waters trailing the Dorset as it made its way to the open sea, that his future lay in Salem. Perhaps the future of civilization lay there as well, another peak waiting for the right individuals, hearts brimming with courage to reach it. Chapter 18. A Dark Key. The book sat on the table untouched as dawn fell through the cracks in the curtains. A mouse, busy sniffing the floor beneath the table for crumbs, lifted its head and stilled its whiskers. As the air grew cold, the mouse flinched and fell over, lifeless. Moments later, the hinges of the door shattered and the door fell in with a bang. The woman with the crooked neck stepped over the threshold and across the fallen door, graceful in spite of her injury. She sniffed the air. Gone. He hadn't even been there since she'd delivered the key for him. Wisps of magic clung to the corners, glows and stains and echoes that shone as clear as the daylight itself. No matter. She would find him and deliver the key. She stepped to the table, lithe, her beauty grown even more ruinous in death. She grasped the book, holding the tattered covers together with reverence, feeling it vibrate with barely checked energies. With a sigh, she cradled it to her chest. Her gaze turned westward. She sensed him as she sensed the rising sun. She spun and turned back to the doorway, footsteps light as she crossed out into the hallway and down the stairs. Those still sleeping in the adjacent rooms had their dreams turned sour. Down the stairs she went. As she neared the bottom, a group of soldiers burst in from the street, scarlet uniforms dragging in the chill of dawn with them. They passed her with nary a glance as they rushed up the stairs. 2 of the 12 would be dead by nightfall. The rest would have curious and disturbing thoughts they wouldn't be able to get out of their minds, a touch of death that 4 of them would carry forward within the fortnight, while the others would bury them down deep to fester, all things in time. The woman with the crooked neck walked out into the bustle of early morning London, ignoring the soldiers out on the street, avoiding the wagons and carriages just setting out on a cold winter's morn. The air was crisp, and thin clouds wore the gold and orange of sunrise. Snow softened the harsh edges all around. She held the book tightly to her chest. As she watched the morning sunlight chase away the last scraps of night, she wound down the lanes, a sad smile on her face, a smile which lingered long in the minds of those she passed, some of whom thereafter possessed a dark key that might slip into the shadowy locks within their hearts. The End. This has been Sorcery of the Stony Heart, written by Kevan Dale, narrated by Rafe Beckley. Copyright 2018 by Kevan Dale, production copyright by Kevan Dale.